Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Abhinav, your host. Today you're in for a very special treat because we are taking it back to 2019, the year we all miss. Pre-pandemic times, when I first started doing podcasting, I really wanted to be doing live streaming shows. So what you're going to find in this episode is one of those shows from 2019. So let's dig into it. Make sure you check it out, that it's also on YouTube. There's a video component to this. We had multiple camera angles. Real fancy stuff right when I wanted to get started in this whole podcasting space. So I would really appreciate it if you guys check this out. Let me know what you think. If you think I should bring these back or continue doing the episodes that I've been doing as of late. Thank you. Let's get into it. You definitely have to do things to keep your mind in a good, healthy state, which involves some form of physical activity. It definitely involves stimulus, like giving yourself positive information, like good reading material, or like listening to shit that like is going to give you good stimulus rather than just the normal like social media manufactured. Everybody's life is so great. Like you got to set aside time for that. I think those are two definitely very important things. I'd absolutely love to hear from all of you. So make sure you reach out to me anywhere that you're on the internet. Just look for The Real Abhinav on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, anywhere that you are, including TikTok. I'm there and I want to hear from you. Thank you again. Let's get back to the show. Thank you, Joseph, for being here on episode number 2. How you doing, man?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to see this very impressive home studio setup you have there.
What do you think? What do you think about it?
It's pretty serious. I'm trying to do my own podcast sometime this year, and I won't be attempting this level of
You are more than welcome
production.
to come and use the studio anytime you like.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So feel free to come and take advantage of this, man. It's here 7 days a week. Do you like to be called Joe or Joseph?
Joseph. I guess my dad was Joe. So growing up, it was always Joe and then Joseph.
Awesome. I love the Superman shirt. As you can see, we represent Superman in this house pretty well.
I see it over there.
Yeah. Awesome, man. And so Joseph is, I don't really want to do too much of an introduction. I kind of want it to just unfold. But, Joseph is CEO of a BioTech startup in San Diego. Is that fair?
Yeah, well, Carlsbad, North County, San Diego.
All right. And we met just a week ago at the longevity meetup here in San Diego, La Jolla, right by University of San Diego.
Yeah, down at the Sanford Burnham.
So tell me, what got you into this whole longevity thing?
So
why do you want to live in this miserable world for so long?
Well, that's a whole other kind of debate, right?
Sure.
Personally, I think, we want the option to live indefinitely. And if you're not satisfied, you can always end yourself, always kill yourself if you decide you're too old and miserable.
For sure.
And of course, to clarify, a lot of people get confused by this. The idea is not to be 90 years old and perpetually feel like an ancient 90-year-old who's miserable and joints hurt. You're going to be indefinitely in a youthful state. So hopefully in your prime for an indefinite amount of time. There's an old classic book and movie called Logan's Run, where the people were essentially all programmed to, die at age 30. Then it turns out they weren't. It was optional. It was called Logan's Run because he tries to run. He tries to flee the society.
Gotcha.
So, there's all kinds of interesting science fiction scenarios. This is also in Blade Runner. If you saw the remake recently, well, the original Blade Runner, right? They programmed these replicants to only live like 4 years. Or
have you seen the movie In Time?
Yeah,
that's one of my favorite movies.
It was okay. That was a while back. I think Justin Timberlake.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you can tell, but I got a Justin Timberlake shirt on. Actually, wasn't even planning to talk about Timberlake today, but you brought up all the science fiction time stuff, so I thought about that movie.
So there's these different distinct issues. Yes, the state of the world is not necessarily great, but you're kind of assuming all of these things are going to stay constant. It's like, you're not going to feel like a burned out, 90-year-old. If we do this right and we get it right, and then you're going to be like in the prime of your life, you'll be youthful and enthusiastic, just like you were when you were still in your early 20s. And you look what happens to people when they age. They hit middle age and everything starts to decline.
Yeah.
Your motivation, and by the time you start getting up in your 60s and 70s, everything dwindles. And the studies they've done of people it shows that you live in the past and just keep like repeating things. This is really true of my dad, for example, because he was in the military and then he was a doctor for many years, and all he ever thinks about is his former military days. That was the most meaningful time in his life. Right. Because he served.
What about today? What about the present?
Yeah. And your brain is actually aging such a point where it cannot form new connections and new, your neuroplasticity has diminished.
Yeah.
So this even happens, unfortunately, like after your teenage years. It's really declining even in your 20s. That's why language acquisition drops off after like 14. And then we just get worse and worse at a lot of things the older we get. And we look at people like Trump. I'm not going to get political on this, right? But it's for any president we've had has always been 60s and up. That's like kind of concerning if we actually realize that by the time you're that age, your brain is not open to new things.
New ideas.
You're like stuck on this. It's like, why do we have a society that is set up where only the people that are older end up with the power? It's ass backwards, actually, right? We have
weird.
this, like, Social Security is completely backwards. It should be that everyone has a stipend when they're young so you can actually travel the world and do things, be creative and productive. And instead, we've set up this economy where you're going to, quote, save for retirement. And if you're lucky, by the time you're 65 or 70, then you can sit on your ass, but then you don't have any energy, right? And you're not going to do anything creative. And all of your best work from artists, scientists, it's been pretty much documented that it was done up until their mid and early 30s, and their productivity period kind of levels off after that. There's some exceptions, okay, with different fields, but I mean, obviously athletics, you've seen it. You have, if you're going to be in the Olympics, you start training at age 6 and you're finished by like age 24 because you've burned out the body is pretty much in it. And that kind of stuff ages you faster too. Depends on the sport.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of stuff you said in there. One thing you mentioned was about neuroplasticity. Now, that was a concept I wasn't familiar with, but I learned about quite like early 2017, actually, late 2017. I was kind of going through my existential crisis, and I was really concerned with a lot of different beliefs that I had and about my life and where it was going. And I kind of fell into a depression, honestly, right? Like that's where things took turn for. And we were talking about this a little bit when I met you. And neuroplasticity, there's a doctor, she's I think he's a neurologist or neurophysicist, I don't know. Works in the brain field for sure. And Dr. Caroline Leaf, maybe you know her.
Okay. I don't know her by name, but
and she's a Christian. So she kind of combines science with like her belief in her faith. And that's great. And she has a practice, basically. It was a 21-day detox, and I did it. All you do, and the science behind it is that you take toxic thoughts and you put them out on paper. And as you're doing them over and over repetitively, you're actually changing the structure of your brain. The dendrites new dendrites are formed when you replace a toxic thought with what you want, out of that. So if there's something really bad, like, I'm terrible at public speaking, then you say like, okay, I'm going to practice talking in front of the mirror 6 times today. And you try to do actionable checks of yourself. I did this for almost a month, man. And almost it just became a writing exercise. I don't know if things actually took place, but I definitely felt better every single day that I did it. And one day that I skipped it in that 21 day, I really felt like, oh my God, I just out of place. It was super weird, but I felt something was working. So like neuroplasticity as a concept, I feel I've experimented with it in that exercise, and I definitely noticed a change in my behavior and in my thought structure. The things that I was concerned about were no longer bothering me because I had almost reasoned them out. In a way, it was therapy for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, neuroplasticity, I've experienced it in that sense. So that was really cool. And the other thing I was going to talk to you or ask you about from what you just said was the people I think pick presidents or whatever is because they think people get older and they're going to be the most wisest people, right? But that's not necessarily the truth anymore because technology is relatively new and people that are very apt on technology are generally younger.
Right. Well, one thing I point out, this is kind of a modern construction. Alexander the Great conquered the known world. He famously, was taking over from his father, King Philip, when he was like 14 years old.
I don't know the story.
So Alexander the Great is kind of this he was the first sort of global empire.
Oh, okay.
Conquered Greece, conquered, his father's Philip of Macedonia. So he was, there's a bunch of biography pictures that have been done of him. Yeah, Alexander the Great.
This cat right here.
Right. So you pull him up. So, but this is actually kind of common in history that, used to be, because all of our constructs around adolescence and stuff is sort of like invented in the last 150 years. You used to be considered essentially an adult when you're like 12 or 14.
Isn't that crazy? People got married around that time.
Right. Well, we did. Yeah, but the point was that young people had leadership capacity.
Isn't it also because people didn't live that long?
That's partly it. Yeah. Too. You died and when you're 40.
Yeah.
So you had to stop
Life
wasting
expectancy
time.
was much lower.
Yeah, but it's more about, speaks to the fact that, but even 100 years ago in the early days of industrialization, right, when you had J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, all of these characters they became called like the robber barons, right? But they were sort of self-made men. It really is about the fact that there weren't these barriers to entry, and the credentialing system that we have in the last pretty much since World War II, so the last 80 years.
I didn't know what a robber baron was.
Yeah, it's just, think of Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and stuff today.
Self-made.
They're the equivalent of the industrial oligarchs, now. We've had this is sort of a, capitalism tends to be a winner-take-all thing that rewards these kinds of industrial hustlers and tycoons who can, become the first in an industry. And a lot of times they were making their money in oil, steel, and the railroads in the 1800s. And this
is around the same time Nikola Tesla was around, right?
Yeah, Tesla was a contemporary at that time.
I know he went to J.P. Morgan.
Edison, right.
To get money for his inventions.
Edison sort of screwed him on everything and got those industrialists pretty much. Yeah.
But also gave us like a lot of good stuff. So it's kind of... I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Blossom Media Studio. Thank you so much for creating and distributing my podcast and taking away literally every single thing that's involved with podcasting so I can just spend the time to talk to my guests and create great episodes.
Well, yeah, this is always history is kind of written by the victors and then reinterpreted. But the point we're making there was just that, like, Alexander the Great was the ruler of the known globe, marched into Egypt. He did all this like before age 30, and then he died from some like poison arrow or something, poison dagger. Or maybe it was appendicitis or something, right? Because anything could take you out back then in the ancient days, right? We didn't have modern medicine. So it's very much arbitrary that we came up with this thing that says now you have to go to high school, then you have to go to college, then you have to go a master's degree, then you need a PhD. None of that is how things have been in history. It's pretty much gatekeepers end up entrenched in whatever field. You've probably seen it in computer science. There was no computer science 60 years ago. It was just electrical engineering was the only degree at MIT. They had bodybuilding, same thing has happened. There used to be no such training certificates. Fair enough. Be a personal trainer. You just started training people. Now you have 1,000 different competing credential systems, and you can't even get in to work as a personal trainer unless you do the NASC, whatever certifications. This is what happens in any field over time. Established people will create barriers. That's also what happens in immigration. In the United States, it's completely a nation entirely of immigrants, and now we've turned around and refused to allow reasonable immigration for other people that want to come to this country. Right? It's just completely insane. So that's, I'm pretty much against all forms of rules and regulation wherever possible. I'm an anarchist.
You're an anarchist? Damn.
Which is a particular, this doesn't mean chaos and disorder, but it's a theory of organization that says that people can self-organize their own systems without coercion and violence.
Where does this come from, Joe? Where did this all start? Why are you like this?
Well, I guess, it goes back to growing up. And
where did you grow up?
I was mostly in South Carolina. So,
okay, cool. I've only been to their airport.
It's not that exciting. Charleston is like the best city.
I think that was the airport I was in.
Visit.
Charlotte. Charlotte?
Charlotte is North Carolina. It's one of the major hubs.
My bad.
But yeah, no, so my
family. I don't go that way very often.
There's not a whole lot now in the Southeast that's necessarily worth.
It's beautiful.
seeing.
A lot of greenery though.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few nice things. It's very scenic. This is from the original 13 colonies, right?
For sure.
Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia. We were kind of the original founding colonies of the United States. Also had slavery, not a good thing. After the Civil War, it never really recovered. So you have this long history of stuff from 1865, and still to this day, we have racial problems and unrest. We have economically, technologically. It's just very different because I've lived all over now. I live, of course, in the Northeast. We'll get to that in a minute. I finally moved to California in 2009. I lived in Australia, London, Brazil
before
for a while.
All of this.
After school, after college.
So what year were you in school?
2000 to 2004.
And for the audience, if you don't know, Joe went to Harvard, and we're going to definitely talk about Harvard because I want to know.
Yeah, we can get into that.
I'm not smart enough to go there, and I want to know what it's really like. But anyway, So you were moved around a whole bunch. Why were you moving around a whole bunch, by the way?
Well, that was after I finished school. I decided to get out and travel. I wanted to get out of the United States for a while because I was so frustrated and burned out on
What made you
certain things.
so frustrated?
Just having come through, done all the things I thought I was supposed to do for
go to this good school,
22 years, come out with this degree thing, and then it's like, and I felt like it was all a scam, which essentially it was. And then
I kind of knew that going into it.
As soon as I saw this, then of course what happens, we have the 2008 meltdown, the financial recession crisis, which was just,
that's right.
We've just pushed that off. So now we're getting ready to come and have the round 2.
That's what we talked with Brad about.
The final reckoning of that.
Yep.
But yeah, by the time I got out of school, I was just like, well, this, is exactly what I thought, that most of the things I've been
you weren't fulfilled for sure.
Are a scam, that you've got to go do this. There was no option except to go to Wall Street, law school, med school, investment banking. This is all my classmates did. Right.
Did you look for a job after college?
I ended up going over to do a master's in London for a year, just to, again, sort of to kill time. Right.
Master's in?
It was history and philosophy of science.
What was your undergraduate in?
It was government and basically political science, political theory.
Wow.
So,
cool.
History of political thought.
And that's like,
this is why I became an anarchist.
Just saying that because it's at the best possible place, for information and those subjects. And
I mean, there's a lot, honestly, you just have to read prolifically. There's only certain classics. Anyone can be educated. You don't have to go to some big.
If we're getting into this, I want to go back a little bit. How the hell did you get into Harvard? First off, were you like a really good student? Like, what did you do?
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you realize that our system is a scam, you have to check certain boxes.
Agreed.
So yeah, I mean, I did. I was the valedictorian, had like 5.0 grade point average, perfect grades.
Getting good grades.
Did all the stupid you have to do these stupid extracurriculars.
Fair
check
enough.
all these boxes. Piano, martial arts.
Who got you in all this? Because your dad?
I just did it. I decided to apply.
How'd you figure it all out?
Right. I mean, honestly, the reason I did it is because Harvard is one of the only ones that has this like super one-page simple application form.
It's
called the Common Application. And it's basically because they get so many applicants.
I'm gonna look this shit up. Is this real?
So like Stanford, for example, I was thinking of applying there and I just threw it out because I couldn't stand their essay. They had like 4 little different essay prompts that were all like, tell us about the time that you failed at this and what did you learn from it? And tell us about your first blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, this is just obnoxious, asinine. I don't want to fill out all this touchy-feely little BS thing, so I didn't apply. So basically, Harvard uses this simplified thing. It's because they have every perfect score person in the world apply. So
Damn, you're right. That's probably from around your time. It's 2004, 2005.
Yeah, so they don't even care. It's like... but I would tell you, like, it's not what it's cracked up to be. I mean, you have to be realistic about this. I didn't really want to go to college because I thought it was a scam. I was like, this sounds like it's like people are telling me I wanted to go and I had all these crazy ideas growing up as a kid, right? And I wanted to go into business and start ventures, right? And it's like, well, everyone says, well, you got to have work experience, but then to have work experience, you have to have a degree. And then it's a catch-22. So it's a paradox because you can't get the experience without the credential. And then to apply for these other degrees, they want to know your experience. So I was like, okay, if this is the way it's going, I'm going to try to just get the biggest name thing that exists in the world.
Let's go to the top.
Get that on there, and then I'll know, because I'm pretty much convinced.
I like that, Joe. I like the way you think. You're like, if I got to do this shit, I'm going to do it right. I'm going to
do it at all,
to
right?
the best school possible. I'm going to get the best degree because
Well,
you're like, might as
you
well.
want the name, right?
Well, if you're going to do it right.
I'm not saying the education is that great.
Fair enough, but
right?
you're like in the system that we're playing in, you're like, I'm going to do that.
However, it kind of backfired, right? Because when I got in there and then it's just like, you're mentally not prepared for this because if you've gone your whole life.
I felt the same way when I went to community college after high school. So, I mean, I feel like it's the same.
Well, what happens is you're going to mind fuck yourself. So everybody there psychs themselves out.
Harvard.
Right. So you get this one thing that's referred to as like imposter syndrome, which is a well-known thing. I had that at my
first job. I still do
Which a lot of people can have that about stuff. I didn't usually suffer from that. And then I got all mentally fucked up for a while. And then I finally, when I was through there, I was like, fuck the shit. I was right. I know that I'm, I kind of lost myself for a while. And then it took me a very long time to get back and realize, hey, actually, I really am more competent than most humans.
Were you working out then?
Yeah, I started training when I was 12. So
here's one thing that I think is a very important factor in the story. Because like you, I started working out, I think, I want to say 16 or 17, right? I was really small in high school. I knew I couldn't really get taller, so wider was a good option. A couple of the older kids in high school that got attention were the ones that were working out because not everybody was at the time, right? I went to high school in 2006.
Okay.
So Instagram wasn't even around yet, right? So, FitFam wasn't a thing. Okay. Right. But like a few people that would work out, I knew that there was something to it. And more than anything, it gave you a discipline. Right. Right. So when I started to develop that discipline, it gave me an insane amount of confidence because it made me feel like I have control over something, right? Because there's not too much that you control in life. You don't control a lot of the outcomes. You put in your effort. You don't necessarily know how it's going to go. But with bodybuilding, it was one of those things where it's like, it's proportional. Like if I work out hard, if I diet, if I stay disciplined,
you can
day
get
in,
some
day out.
kind of thing out of it. But unfortunately, of course, the judging is completely over the place.
Apart from the competing part, just the discipline of doing
just to change the way you look, you can do it. Yeah, I prefer powerlifting in some ways because it's more objective and you can just hit your records and your lifts and know what could take that from you. I've done a few bodybuilding shows where the judging was so off that I got, and even this was like one of my third shows or something. And I was like getting so down about it afterwards that for a couple months I couldn't I couldn't train. It was like, it ruined the whole activity for me because the show was so bogus. Right. And it's really all about learning the intrinsic versus extrinsic. You cannot do this for any other reason but for yourself.
By the way, I just realized, since we're live, so there's shit's going to go wrong. It still says Bradley's name. This is not Bradley, by the way, guys. This is definitely Joseph Jackson.
Well, you can just change it on the
I'm going to change it later.
It's fine. Not a big deal.
It's not a big deal. But, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
This is going to happen, man. The first few ones is going to happen.
I don't think it's gonna affect people's life viewing experience.
No, this is raw. This is real. Why we're doing this real? Because I want this to be raw.
So yeah, I mean, I guess look, if you want to get in one of these places, I don't know. Like these days, it's just worse and worse. Nobody can get in. The acceptance rates are worse than ever.
You get out of school, getting a job is just as hard as it was to get into school.
Right. That's a whole other thing.
Because you don't have experience.
You basically, if you were there, you need to be networking the whole time, trying to maneuver and line up your next thing. So, and I didn't understand that going in because I'm from South Carolina, right? And a lot of the people I'm going in there with are all from New England. They've been in prep school. They've been coached their whole fucking life for this to go in Harvard and like dominate. And once I didn't get that. Like I thought when I get in, I'm set. My life is fixed. It's like, no, when the race begins. Was like, welcome to the Hunger Games. Like you got to be ready. Elimination game. You know what I mean? It's like vicious. Okay. So you get in and I didn't have that. Like I only caught on like after the first year. Well, the whole thing went wrong. So my first entire thing, I was assigned to live with this guy as a roommate, and he was completely nuts. He was cracking up. He had already had like long-standing mental illness before he came. He was OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It manifests in many ways, but people may wash their hands is the classic one, but it may be that you check the door 15 times when you're going in and out of the door to make sure you lock the door. It's compulsive thoughts, and you manifest in a ritual behavior. Some people pluck their hair out and their nails out. So it was a bunch of stuff. It definitely the door. He was doing the door thing, but his behavior, I knew really
like freshman
early
year we're
on.
talking?
Yeah, because I was assigned to live with him. I knew from the moment we talked on the phone, because they give you each other's number before you get up there to talk. I was like, this guy's a little odd. This doesn't sound right, because he's like going on and all these grandiose things about how he plays these instruments. He wrote this play and he did all these things. I'm like, yeah, well, I know you're at Harvard. So there's all these people that are going to be multidisciplinary, whatever, Renaissance man. But the guy just seemed off because he was going on and on about himself in a very grandiose way. I knew I was in trouble when we moved in. His parents came in. He hung a picture of Einstein on the wall that he had drawn, a hand-drawn Einstein thing.
Was it good?
It was okay. I mean, I'm not an artist. I can't do it. I asked other people later how it was, and they said, yeah, it's all right. It's like mediocre. But he was like, he literally started proclaiming he was going to become the next Einstein. He was going to major in astrophysics and all this. I was like, okay, not very humble.
So not necessarily.
Right?
Wow. Okay.
But so we get into like about 6 weeks into the semester, and I'm like, he just kept getting weirder and weirder. And sure enough, like, we got to the midterms day, and then people came back. They're like, what happened to your roommate, man? I heard he like ran up to the front of the like classroom and collapsed or something in the midterms. Ooh. And so he was hospitalized for, like anxiety panic attack for a few days. So he comes out, and then like basically his mom is having to come in. They lived in New York. So she was up there for several weeks. She's like administering certain quiet time, making sure he's taking these medications to tranquilize him. And I'm just getting weirded out because like, this is my first time living away from home. I had this roommate. So finally, I moved into our smaller room. We had a 2-room kind of suite with like a common room and then a little area for the bedroom. So I was like, I'll take this small room and just let it be my bedroom so I could get, some space from him. But it just kept degenerating and went worse and worse the way the semester dragged on.
Right.
He went back in, and then finally in the spring, I come back. I'm just like, all of my grades were getting affected. My study was thrown off. Everything was off because I'm so like stressed out with this weird situation being around this guy.
I want to take another quick moment to thank our sponsors, Podcast Backdrops. If you do any kind of video content or pictures online, or you're doing any sort of selling over Zoom calls, you really need to check them out because it will make you look professional from the get-go. Having your brand, your logo, and what you're all about behind you, hiding all your clutter, makes you look so much more professional when you put yourself out there on the internet. So check out Podcast Backdrops if you want to level up your game.
And I finally come back one day and heard that the people in my hallway are like, what's going on with your guy? And he was escorted out by university police. He was down on the second floor causing some disturbance.
This is after he came from the hospital?
This was after like 2 hospitalization episodes.
Good Lord.
And holidays.
And you were still with them. You couldn't get reassigned or anything.
I was trying to fight. So this is the thing. Harvard doesn't give a shit. They like will stonewall you.
Harvard, if you're listening.
They don't care. That's what I'm telling you. They have a $40 billion endowment. They have more money than whatever. So basically that was it for me. That was the last straw. I went and confronted our freshman dean. I left a note on his door. It was on a weekend when I came back on a Friday when this had happened. And I was like, please call me, whatever. I need to have some answer, like what's going on with this. I can't keep living around this guy. So, and then I went to my resident advisor, who was like a clueless 23-year-old. She just graduated herself and was spending a year on the dorm because she's trying to prep for med school. Okay. So she needed to pad her resume. All right. So the dean guy did not like this at all, that I bothered him on a weekend. So he kind of like finally calls me in.
What, did you send him an email?
I put a taped a note to his door, like on the weekend thing, because I needed, a response. And so we go in for this meeting, and I'm like, look, I've been covering for this guy for 7 months, trying to pretend I don't know about his medical issues. Like, I don't want to know about his medical stuff. I don't like the fact that he's leaving prescriptions out. Now I see all of his drugs that he's on. Like, this is like, should be confidential information. And now I'm seeing it. And I'm like, I'm covering for people asking stuff on the hall. Like,
you're just trying to be a genuine human being. You're not trying to spread stuff.
Like, this was not a good thing. Like, why I was assigned to live with this person that you guys knew had a long-standing, for many years, all through high school and everything, existing mental illness. You have $40 billion of fucking endowment. It's like, you guys could have assigned him to be in a private room. They have single rooms. I was like, so you knowingly, can put me in with someone that has a serious thing, and it's obvious that when you're a first year at a stressful thing, your strategies won't work. You're going to have trouble coping. So probably he was going to go off the rails. And so I basically said, look, I need to know what's the plan, what's going on. I can't, if he comes back again, because he went home for however many weeks, I need to know. I'm not comfortable staying around it or whatever. And this dean guy just like basically attacked me, made me feel like I was doing
physically?
Everything wrong. No, mentally. He says he's like,
damn, did you get him on?
And I was like, I said basically, yeah, he's not a physical. Yeah, he was this dweeby little guy.
Are you sure? Because you're a bodybuilder looking like 22, 21? No, you were 18 or 19,
I was like
right?
18, yeah.
And you're like a yoked 18-year-old
and
you're walking into
exactly. So I tried to be as mature as I could about this. I said, listen, my parents, they're freaked out. They don't know what's going on. They want some kind of answer because they're paying all this money here to this ridiculously expensive place. Fair and he's like, no, we don't have to speak to your parents at all. You're 18. You're considered, not a minor, blah, blah, blah. We have no obligation to do anything. And I was like, wait a minute. You didn't understand anything of what I just said. Doesn't matter what you think you're obligated to do. It's courtesy, politeness, damage control. The fact that this has happened, you owe my parents a phone call, to assuage their valid concerns about this thing that's going on here.
You're a smart young kid.
So he completely trashed me.
Flipped out.
Basically, the guy made me feel like you're shit. You don't matter to us. We don't care at Harvard. We don't give a fuck. It's your problem, your fault for reacting this way. So I went back and just did nothing. He was like, write up a position statement for me and then I'll bring it up for review before our next committee meeting with the deans of freshmen thing. So I didn't do anything. I was like, well, this seems like he's trying to like get me to write stuff up in writing so he could entrap me or have some record. So I did nothing. So what I finally did, I just called my roommate at home. He was back in New York recuperating. And he just told me he was not coming back. He was withdrawing for the rest of the year. But this was already like end of February, March. So we'd lost most of the whole year. And the dean sat on that for a couple weeks. So the decision had already been made that the guy was already withdrawing. And the dean guy didn't even bother getting back to me. Finally, a few weeks later, he emails us like, your roommate has decided to withdraw. And I was like, well, great. I didn't say anything. I was like, well, I already knew that because I just called him up and communicated, wasn't this hard. Didn't have to be this hard. You just communicate. We don't have to be ashamed of mental illness and covering up stigma. But I learned is like Harvard has done this. They've had murder, suicides and stuff where one of the roommates stabbed. This case had happened like 10 years before me or 6 years before where a girl had stabbed her roommate to death with scissors. And Harvard just like covers it up. They paid off the family and they have a ubiquitous.
Is this online, you think?
Yeah, you can find the case. So they have this like huge mental health crisis on campus where people are just horribly depressed. Because everybody there was like a superstar growing up and is extremely competitive, perfectionist, which is what I was my whole life, right?
Dude, this is it, 1995.
Yeah, so that had happened 5 years before I get there. I'm there in 2000, right? God. And I'm like, so you guys don't think to have any new policy?
Hold on, Joe. You knew about this?
I didn't know until I looked stuff up later after my experience dealing with the guy, right?
Got it.
So then it gets worse, right? So like a few years later, I read that this dean, I came across an article in the Boston Globe. And there's a blind girl that Harvard has taken. They do this a lot. They'll have kind of students with special needs stuff. Mm-hmm. So she had a brain tumor that had pushed on her optical nerve and caused her to be completely blind.
Right.
She gets into Harvard, starts her first year. She's like failing math by her first midterms semester.
I was failing math my first semester of calculus.
That's because she has no way to like get the notes. She needs a special tutor.
I had a terrible teacher too.
So basically she ends up in front of the same dean that I dealt with, this man-call guy, who's his name's dean of freshmen. And I read the whole article in the Boston Globe about how rude and awful he was at the way he treated her. He basically threatened her too and said, it's your responsibility. If you're here, you've got to, meet
to somebody with special needs.
Yeah. And so she finally got a good classmate who was in her thing that became her like assigned, helped her as her assistant thing, and she managed to pull out a grade and pass it. But I remember reading about this. This was after I'd left. So it was 2005. I'd already graduated in 2004. And I was living in Australia at the time. And I saw this article come up. I was like, wow, this is the same prick dean. He's still in that position of power. And now he's like beating up on a blind girl. It made me sick. I was so angry. So I carried this sort of resentment for many years about this stuff.
So is that where like some of your resentment for authority came in from?
Yeah, that's one of the main things. And then of course I grew up in this family. My dad was military.
An old guy, right?
Yeah, he was only like 30s to 40. He was probably 38. But it's like any pissant bureaucrat, when they get a tiny bit of power over young people,
for sure,
right? They go crazy because look what he is in his life. He's nothing but a little administrator dweeb.
Fair enough.
And he deals with 18-year-olds, right? Just think. So and I think one of the things I think he was gay. And I'm going to say
that was a suppression, you thought?
I think that it's like, when people are mistreated as part of some other group thing, they take it out on other people. So probably
I know that for sure.
He was probably not in the closet. He's probably openly gay. That's what I mean. But because he'd grown up being discriminated against or something, now as soon as he got a chance to lash out at other people, because I was trying to psychoanalyze this guy. I'm like, what's driving him to be such a shit to people, right? And I'm like, this could be part of it is maybe he's just like got this anger of his own.
Can't really, that. I mean, because at that time, we're still in the early 2000s. You can't really
the 2000s, it was really pretty much, well, you would have been at Harvard, you would have been out there super liberal and everything. So it wouldn't have been a thing. That wouldn't have been a factor for him being admitted, a thing. But it would have been when he grew up, because he was probably 40s.
Bullied.
So he was growing up in the era where maybe he was bullied a bunch as a kid. I mean, some people are just, pricks. That's why they go into this and become administrators in the first place, because they like to get off on having little tiny bits of power.
Yeah, it could be.
But so that was basically the whole thing felt like a disaster because I never got back on track after that first year, because you have to pick your roommates for your next years. You have to get assigned to a group. So it threw my socialization and everything off that first year. And then the next year I decided I would study obsessively. I got all A's for the one semester there. And then I realized, well, that's just pointless, because it doesn't correlate with any, I finally realized almost everybody else was hardly studying. They're just doing the minimum to pass, because it's really easy to get a B+ and almost impossible to get an A- or an A. So you have to do all this extra work to get from this thing, or else you can just half-ass it and you'll get kind
C's
of
get degrees.
Right. Well, something like that. Exactly. So
that's what somebody literally told me.
But what I realized is that everyone in there was spending most of their time strategically networking and positioning themselves for after graduation.
Yeah, that's what you should do.
And I was stupidly reading all these assigned readings. And I felt like no one's actually reading the reading. And you didn't do the reading. I had stacks of books and I read every fucking page and was annotating. And it made no difference for the actual class for passing the thing. So I was like, okay, so this whole thing is just you gamify the system. You want to do the minimum. And that was discouraging too, because I'm the type of person that wants to put 100% effort in something, and I'm used to seeing
the result.
Again, effort and result. And then I realized when I got there, it's arbitrary. It depends on your teaching fellow, how well they like you. And these are a bunch of grad students that have to teach you. You don't even get much professors interaction. You barely ever talk to a real professor. It's just a bunch of poor grad students that are required.
That is true, because a lot of the time you can't, especially at universities with class numbers being 300-400 people.
Yeah.
Well, you can never get the professor's attention.
Sure.
You only have to stick with the TAs.
And the successful students, I realized some of my classmates, they would go and attach themselves to a big name professor. Basically suck up to them a whole bunch, volunteer for the thing, and they'll get all the recommendation letters. So there were all these things I just had not known, what to do. I would have game planned it differently, and then you become this ruthless.
Do you remember
operator.
how much it used to cost to go there?
At that point, it was only $50,000 a year. Right, and that's
a year.
That's 18 years ago or whatever. Right. See, so that's the thing. It's it's crazy. So Harvard will say
UCI was $14,000 a semester,
right? And Harvard will say stuff like, "Oh, well, many of our students are on some kind of financial support."
Shit.
But what that means is they take a subset of people that are wealthy and have them pay full price, and then a bunch of other people get financial assistance. But you're not super wealthy. You still have to pay full price. Even if you're middle class,
67,000,
two incomes. Yeah, so it's gone up every year with inflation, right?
Insane.
But the whole thing is a scam, okay? And this is what I would tell you. But, grad school is even worse. It's just the same, and it goes on and on.
That's $270,000 of debt.
Yeah, it's nuts, right?
That's like a Lamborghini,
This
dude.
is why I would not recommend it to anyone. So later on in my career, I became a mentor to this Thiel Foundation 20 Under 20 program.
What's that?
Peter Thiel is the founder of PayPal. So he's this eccentric billionaire.
Didn't he work with Elon Musk?
Yeah, they were co-founders of that. So I got to know them somewhat in Silicon Valley when I lived there.
We'll go there next.
Yeah, so he's also a supporter of life extension longevity.
Oh,
and
really?
funded that.
But so that's where your interest sparked.
I ended up meeting a lot of these strange characters that are in the tech world that are also interested in these transhumanist technologies.
Oh, cool.
Futurist technologies. So Thiel set up this thing for kids to say, don't go to college or take a year out of college. It was actually more radical when it started. He was basically saying, undergrad is a ripoff, and he would pay $100,000 for a 2-year fellowship if talented kids who had gotten into Harvard and Yale and Stanford applied for this thing would come out to Silicon Valley instead and work on their idea.
Right.
So you'd get this all expenses paid thing and a network of mentors such as yourself, very credible characters like me mentoring these young 18-year-olds and ranting at them and telling them, all of my war stories.
Sure.
But so
you got to do it. If you don't, then they're going to have the same experience. And then how do you fix it?
Well,
so
it's very hard because people are still going to Harvard now and they don't understand the brand name.
That's
and
what is the marketing, though.
I wouldn't have been able to convince myself as my younger self until I had gone there and seen how bad it was.
The system has to change and what its acceptance criteria of credibility is. And in some way, I think tech is disrupting that because once I started working in Silicon Valley, I worked with numerous people who never went to school for computer science and were self-taught programmers and kick ass.
Yeah, and that's true whenever you have something that's really objective and you can actually measure the work. And most of our global economy is bullshit jobs. So you can't really tell somebody.
Heard of this book?
Yeah, David Graeber, bullshit work. I'm familiar with him. We were on some of the same mailing lists 10 years ago. So
you know David Graeber?
We were all in the same peer-to-peer stuff. Yeah. So back again, after
blow my mind,
when
Joe.
I burned out of Harvard, I got so frustrated with it. I ended up seeking out this alternative system. So I had a couple of key experiences, right? One was I had this bioethics class with this fairly famous professor. And everyone of my classmates and the professor, they were all sort of hostile to biotech, to life extension, human cloning, embryo editing, all of that. They thought they were very conservative. They're like, oh, we shouldn't be doing these things with the new technology.
What was their field of work?
I mean, so this bioethics is sort of a ridiculous field of a bunch of philosophers and talking heads that think that they're going to say something profound about how we should use biology, right? In reality, they're just making a professional career, being called up to issue a position statement for one thing or another whenever something pops up in the news, right? So we recently had the world's first gene-edited babies out of China in November, and everyone freaked out about that, right?
Yeah.
So I wrote a paper on that in 2002 discussing and predicting this and saying, here's the potential guidelines, what we should be doing for thinking about doing genetic engineering of humans. Because this has been around for a long time. We've been trying to do this for 100 years. Some Brave New World came out, about 100 years ago. People have been wanting to do some form of eugenics for a very long time.
What does that mean?
Eugenics, essentially the idea that we would shape the human gene pool in a positive direction. And there were many. Who
decides what's a positive direction?
Right. So there's been associations with Nazism and all of these things that kind of tainted it, but and you always had these elitist sort of tendencies with it. And it ended up getting tied up with racism and these other ideas. And so there were crazy Nobel Prize winners that tried to start their own sperm bank because they thought they had superior intelligence DNA.
Boy.
Right. So eugenics has sort of been given a bad name. But if you really think about it, we do this in everything we do, from our dog breeding, when we select different traits in our pets, to all of agriculture and all of our animal livestock for a few thousand years, right? It's just that we've been limited in the way we can do it.
And GMO would be part of it, no?
Yeah. So I am very much in favor of GMO. But I don't like the corporate
it also
overlords
has a bad
that
sort of connotation attached to it because honestly, the average person doesn't understand enough about it.
Yeah. I mean, everything is GMO in a sense. Okay.
Yeah.
People are sort of confused about this. Organisms exchange genes all the time in their environment. Bacteria do what's called horizontal gene transfer, where they can actually acquire certain genetic material from their environment. Typically, gene transfer is thought of as vertically passed down from generation to generation, but there's all sorts of tricks that nature has done, and nature is much weirder than we ever understand or give it credit for. There's naturally occurring hermaphrodites that are both genders. There are things that change gender in their own lifetime. So humans that don't really study biology get very hung up on a lot of things and say stuff like, well, that's not natural, or blah, blah, blah. They can't even handle transgender people.
It's funny, people have this perception about chemicals, right? Like everything is a chemical, though.
Yeah,
Water is a chemical, guys.
All of the things in the periodic table, every element of the universe is a chemical element, right? So there's no such thing as natural.
There's no natural anything.
Or non-natural. By definition, whatever exists is natural. It's part of nature. And it's the combination.
Even if it's synthesized in a lab, you're taking natural pieces.
But, the configuration of molecules can either be arsenic or anthrax, something that's poisonous, or it can be beneficial, or the dosage amount determines that effect. So you can overdose on water and die from water, drinking too much water. You can overdose on most any substance. But anyway, so we got kind of a tangent there. But back to this thing, right? So I had a couple of fundamental experiences. One was using Napster and doing the first file sharing when I was a freshman, because I for the first time had unlimited access to music. So then I thought, well, this is amazing. It could transform the economy. We could all produce our own content. And then exactly like what we're doing today, 18 years later, right? Yeah, but then I learned, I did this biology ethics class, and I was exposed to these ideas and disagreed with all of the conservative people that were afraid of this. So I said, well, I got to find the people that are the opposite, that are embracing the potential. And then I got connected to the longevity, life extension movement. Or said, we're going to be able to engineer ourselves to live hundreds of years, thousands of years, indefinitely, and basically cure aging, among other, far out ideas. And at the time I thought, this is crazy. Is this real? Right. And then I met some of the leading people in the field. And, again, they've been working on this since the 1980s, because there was a lot of optimism around technology. You have to remember, we landed on the moon. People thought we were going into space. And unfortunately, things kind of stalled out. We had the internet and all these other things.
Stopped on
we stopped pushing many boundaries in what we'd call like hard technology. And partly it's because the internet was so profitable and lucrative, everybody started dumping money into that. And then you end up with, well, what happened to our flying cars? What happened to our
It seems like it's all gone into making software, which now is dictating based off of your interest patterns what to sell you. And it's automated to sell you that shit.
Yeah, so you can get stuck in these loops that are unfortunately.
I think majority of us, and I was recognizing this in myself, I'm stuck in some of these, and I find myself and I catch myself and I have to get myself out of it. Like, you're like, wait, I've just been scrolling through like a marketplace. What am I doing?
Well, it's been engineered to hack your brain.
Right. They're hacking your biological systems to keep you interacted. Wow.
So, but anyways, by the time I ended up getting out towards the end of Harvard, I was about like burned out. I was practically have a nervous breakdown.
So you did finish the 4 years, though.
Yeah, I was like, I got to be done with this in 4 years. But it almost felt like it almost killed me. Right. Yeah, because I was so depressed. By the last year, I was just in complete chronic depression the whole year. Then one of my other classmates killed himself. I was working out, but I'll tell you the interesting thing about it. The year that I got out, I gained about 30 pounds muscle because I'd been so stressed the whole 4 years. I made no progress for 4 years. I didn't add anything to my lifts, and it was dark all the time. It was super dark in Boston. So I'm like super white.
Yeah, you're pale.
And I'm like, and as soon as I got out, the whole first 12 months, I was eating more food all the time. I added like 80 pounds to my lifts. My bench went up a huge amount. Man. It was like this huge surge because I just had 4 years.
Testosterone was probably suppressed.
It was like a prison camp. It's almost like I call it like a concentration camp. I'm exaggerating, okay? Sure. But the effect is similar on your immune system and the stress and all that. So by the time I was finishing up, I went to some lectures of this professor who was visiting, giving a talk, and I came across this whole idea of peer production, commons-based peer production, which to me was just like a light bulb. It unlocked this whole theory to me that said, okay, well, this is what's wrong with capitalism. This is why I'm miserable, hating everything here at this institution of Harvard, which is supposed to be a wonderful place with billions of dollars of resources, but everyone's miserable, right? So this professor wrote some of the first analysis of this, and now a bunch of people have, you've probably heard about the sharing economy and all these things, right?
That's what the scooters are, right? Like the bird scooters.
Those are all versions of it. Those are kind of like capitalism's attempt to co-opt it. Because what happens is usually we had things like couch surfing originally started up in San Francisco area. Craigslist was originally a purely peer-to-peer free resource. It's a way for you to advertise without having to go into newspaper classified listings, right? And eventually Airbnb came along and took over the model of couch surfing, but made a venture capital-based hyper-capitalist version. So capitalism is very resilient and will resist many attempts to subvert it for change. But yeah, so the best example was a Linux operating system, right? So we had in the 80s, the Free Software Foundation, Richard Stallman started this. And then in the 90s, Linus Torvalds came along and modified it into what became Linux. And today, most of the world runs on some versions of different open source stacks, right? So you have different pieces of technology that are all modular and can talk to each other. And so now you can spin up your own, your entire podcast, right? Running on top of a stack of these open tools.
That's what Apple took it to the next level, but still at the core.
And you can always sell
Linux.
A proprietary version. You can always sell a commercial version, but the fact is the freedom of that free version keeps everyone honest.
Oh, for sure.
So if the commercial provider tries to screw everybody, people will say, screw that, we're going to fork that, we'll open up this version and people can migrate. So you don't get locked in, again, the way we are to most of our products in society. So a
lot of SaaS is disrupting that now.
Sure, yeah. But it's about more than software. This is about a way of life, right? And if you look at the history of humanity, peer production has been here for longer than capitalism and longer than these market forms of exchange. It used to be that the village, you would basically get your neighbors together. And there's a good example of these Amish barn raising. It's a tradition there where you help them raise their barn up, erect the barn. And then when it's their time, you reciprocate. So we've always had these like thousands of years of reciprocal peer-based economic exchange.
Give and take.
And there's another guy, Clay Shirky, who made a career out of this, writing a bunch of books. He talks about basically you used to be able to organize a birthday party, and that was like the extent of what you could do on a love-based peer production model where everyone's intrinsically motivated.
Hold on, I have a question. Just popped up in my head.
Sure.
How are the girls at Harvard? Do you meet some hot girls there?
It's such a stressful situation there. It's like, I mean, honestly, so you know what they would do is they would kind of bust down these girls from the all-girls school. They were co-ed. Yeah, they called it the fuck truck. Ridiculous. I never partook of that particular ritual.
You can tell me off air.
No, I know. But seriously, here's the thing. I had a girlfriend the whole time. There was long distance. It was my high school girlfriend.
Damn.
So that was probably not the best decision. Time, because that was another added stress. Sure. I should have been single or enjoying myself doing whatever. But I was pretty much spoken for the whole time I was in college. Damn. Right, which is probably one of those things.
Would have made a whole nother good segment, but all right.
That I would do over, right? So yeah, I guess I was a late bloomer, blossomer with that respect, and decided to go out later and make up for lost time.
So you went to London, and that's where you let loose, eh?
Well, no, I mean, I've been in London, Australia, Brazil.
You're like, I got to take the tour of the islands and everything. I got the idea. What does it have to offer me? You went all out on a buffet. Is essentially what you're saying.
You had enough vanilla, yeah. Right. Well, anyway, all right. So basically, I listened to this talk, right, where this professor was documenting all these examples of sharing and new ways of building connected production. And the enabling factor was that it gets cheap enough to coordinate people through personal computers, and now our transaction costs are much lower. So the reason we have corporations is to solve something basically called Coase's theorem. Ronald Coase is a famous economist who came up with the theory of the firm, and basically says that transaction costs drive corporate organization. So in order to solve the cost of communicating across different divisions, you end up forming a company to do that. And then you basically default to an authoritative model as opposed to an anarchic, cooperative, non-hierarchical model. And it used to be people think we could only do this. This is why we have governments, we have armies. You could only fight a war if you've got a command structure that's top down. And there's a whole other guy, John Robb, has done all this stuff about the next generation warfare. He calls open source insurgency, open source warfare. And he's documented how for the last 15 years, ISIS, Afghanistan, all of these different groups that basically they've adopted open source style guerrilla tactics.
Pretty much, they're like outsourcing vigilante.
Yeah,
work.
and it's so there's no one in command. They're activating terrorists. Even.
But tell me, ask you why aren't we doing the same thing though? Like in some disguise, like all these secret operations. I mean, that's what we're doing too, aren't we?
Well, that's still like an officially carried out, like CIA. All these special forces have like official formal command structures. Whereas
right, I thought they employ like local.
Yeah, they do some of that, but it's not.
And that's where like the whole.
It's not the same as like an open source insurgency. Like anyone could start a cause, right? Like this. You don't.
Now it's social media, even faster.
Right. Exactly. So all these things are connected, right? And it's been driven by this decentralized sort of effective distributed technology.
Fair enough.
And the hope was that we'd be able to harness these forces for good, right? In a way that you could not be alienated from your work. Again, like this is the classic thing of capitalism. You're working for the boss that owns the factory, right? The stereotypical, model. And we'd hope that we're going to have an explosion of what we call peer production. First in digital media, as you're seeing with musicians could start their own thing without a record label. You don't have to be signed to a contract.
Right.
And instead of the top 40 artists, you could have 4,000 different people on Spotify and on this stuff, right? So it becomes a long tail distribution. And then that says instead of like a blockbuster model where it's only a few top 10 artists get all the views, you could have everyone get a few thousand views and everyone becomes a creator and a producer and exchanging value again. And in reality, it did not end up in this utopian thing. Of course, the celebrities and people still capture the platforms, things like the Kardashians, the people that baffles
there's
me,
a lot more
right?
people that are able to tap in. And
sure.
The early adopters of the platforms are definitely able to become more influential. But I suspect in the long term, it's going to, the sort of 10-second fame is going to disappear and people are going to start seeking for substance rather than just.
That's the hope, but it's all based on our information algorithms, right? But the idea would be that there's not going to be mega blockbuster celebrities. Broadcasting is done. Everything becomes multicasting or narrowcasting, where you have small, different audiences. So if you look at the 20th century, it was like an anomaly. We never had these things like mass broadcast radio and TV. When we started out, it was just NBC, ABC, CBS, only 3 main broadcast networks. Then you had cable, right? But things like the Super Bowl, where literally half the nation watches one event, that's kind of a weird thing in history. It never, it's not normal.
Right.
And it's fixating our attention on one thing, right? So it's actually much better, more efficient when we can DVR everything, put it on your thing to watch, time shift it, watch it on your schedule. We don't all have to tune in at the same night, of the week for that hit show.
Netflix is killing it.
Right. But so all of this was like a hope that we could return to kind of ways like it used to be hundreds of years ago before this particular mass model and the
So you're saying software has pretty much enabled or leveled the playing field in many different ways.
That's the hope, but then there's still these distribution monopolies. Like it's ever present. It's always a battle.
You think about it, there's still a few, right? Like, AWS,
right?
And then Oracle
They're the
runs
biggest hosting
the
thing
biggest
now.
database. Everybody's got an Oracle database, and you get concerned. Well, it's like, okay, well, we are putting some of these powers in one or two houses.
Sure, yeah, but so it's these cycles of centralization, and then when that gets so bad and brittle, you look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And arguably the United States is at this point too now.
A lot of people would argue that, right? You're right, because we're at the point where you would think the revolution is about to happen.
When these institutions fail, then you have a wave of decentralization, but then you have re-centralization again. And right now, all that's going at hyperspeed in the cryptocurrency world, right? So I've been immersed in that for a few years. All of that stuff came out.
Did you make a lot of money?
No, unfortunately, I didn't get in it in the first wave. I should have been in like 2013. But it's not too late.
I have a quick story about that. When we were in college, so I went to Saddleback College for a couple of years, and then I transferred to UC Irvine for my last two. So I finished my computer science degree in 4 years. While I was at UCI, Bitcoin was starting to become kind of popular.
Yeah.
We ended up, a couple of my friends ended up building a miner.
Yeah.
Okay. And then they put it in my apartment. Reason being, because the way my apartment was built, I got my rent, including
your utilities,
capped. Right?
That's hilarious.
Well, the funny thing was, we let that miner on, right? And then a month later, I got my utility bill. It was like 3 times what it is, and they're like, "We're gonna let you off this hook this one time." And I was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna unplug this thing right now." But man, shit,
that's funny.
But they did capture a few, I believe, and one of my friends did make a fuckload of money off of that. So it's great.
Well, again, it's very still early and it's all relative, right? So I believe Bitcoin is like probably the most important innovation.
It's like a brand now
of this whole century,
of this whole crypto,
right? So you can always get Bitcoin now and hold it, and it's going to keep going up in waves until potentially the world is using it as a reserve standard for all economic value on the planet.
Because for those people that don't know, like, the dollar is considered a fiat currency. It's not backed by shit. Like it used to be backed by the gold at one point, but no longer is the case. We're printing and
the United States
creating debt all the time.
The U.S. manipulated the world order to basically use the dollar as a reserve. So we made the Saudis denominate oil's futures contracts in dollars. And if we uncouple from that, it's going to be historically.
It's President Nixon, right, who made that shift?
Yeah, that's right. From the
crazy
gold.
man.
But anyway, I mean, we could talk about Bitcoin all day, but it's fundamentally like potentially a way that we can move to more freedom in the world.
So after Harvard, after your sort of weird experience there.
Sure. So I just became obsessed with this peer-to-peer model, and I saw it everywhere. I was like, well, every
you were
industry.
still in Boston when you were seeing this, or you were out?
Yeah, when I was finishing at Harvard, and then I ended up going to London.
Where did you start to see more of this sort of open source share?
Yeah, I mean, so it's literally started first in digital media, and then we had Wikipedia, YouTube, all those platforms, and then we kept seeing it coming into the physical world with ride sharing and hotels and anything where there's excess capacity that someone can list and connect for low transaction costs means that the peer production model is viable. Right. And so then I basically joined this mailing list. I met this character, Michelle Bowens, who's the first guy to document all this. He lives in Thailand. He had started this peer-to-peer group, and a lot of these people were on it, like Dave Graeber, even the Satoshi, the inventor of Bitcoin, was on it. He announced Bitcoin to our list in the end of 2008.
Is it an actual person?
Yeah.
Or is it an organization? Do you think?
Satoshi was probably this guy named Hal Finney is their best theory. He died in 2014. He was a programmer that had ALS. So if it was anybody, it's very likely he could have been Satoshi.
He's like the top notch, the best programmer that ever existed.
He didn't have to be the best in the world. What he had to do was combine all of these ideas that had been around there for about 20 years and then have it in that unique white paper and get it out there. And then, it just happens that the incentives were correct, where people actually mined this thing and they did it long enough that it got the network effect. And now it's potentially taking over the world. Right. Because even Bitcoin's probably wasn't the best implementation of this thing, but now that it's good enough and it has the network penetration, it's probably game over.
It's more like, I think there's a definite distinction between Bitcoin and blockchain. It's a subset. So technology is of blockchain.
I tell everyone not fall for this thing that Bitcoin is the only particular blockchain that matters. It's the only non-political form of money on the planet. It's what's the word I'm looking for?
the framework that is used by blockchain can be fundamentally utilized in contracts.
Yeah,
or
you can
all
do a
different
bunch
various-
of different applications.
Yeah.
The problem has been that people just got on the bandwagon and they wanted to do blockchain for all sorts of things you don't
Oh yeah,
need
there's
to do it for.
stupid shit for blockchain right now. Startups that are for I was reading some articles about this. It's like blockchain startups are just
You
all
could
over.
do it for anything, but in most of the time, a database will work better, right? Yeah, but one of the only areas we really needed this and why it
Currency.
can be worth this trillions of dollars is a currency that can't be
enough.
fucked with.
Yeah, that has some merit to it.
Yeah, that's not able to be manipulated by governments, state actors, and others.
Agreed.
So anyway, so I ended up going over to London to do a master's. And again, I had delved into the biology
What'd you do your master's
side.
in again?
This was history of science, philosophy of science. So I wanted to look at the history of scientific theories and kind of it's sort of like a meta theory of science. It's like, what is science? How does science function? So I think that was valuable. I mean, it was, again, it's sort of like I could have just read all those thinkers. I didn't need to be at the
But it
London
gave
School
you a
of Economics.
dedicated time in society to do
But
it.
it's like, all right, we'll go over there and do this for you.
Yeah.
But so then I went to Australia to work with the molecular biology agriculture group, and they were one of the first to try to do an open source biology. They were going to release a toolkit for doing GMOs and say, hey, Monsanto and these big corporations are like the Microsoft of crops, and they're controlling our global food supply by controlling the tools to edit the genes. So what if we release toolkit for farmers? Anyone in the world wants to modify plants and democratize agriculture again, because since the 1980s, these big multinationals kind of cornered the market on seeds. They even sell you seeds that have a terminator seed. It's built in where it will die. You can't replant the seed. So for thousands
you
of
have
years,
to keep buying the seed.
yeah, but thousands of years, farmers would always replant. They would share seeds with each other.
Right.
They made that illegal. So if you pirate the seed, or even if it drifts off your field onto someone else's thing, they've sued people for that case. All kinds of crap, right? So I'm very much anti-intellectual property. By the way, I'm against like all
You're
forms
very open
of
source.
it because it's just a monopoly. It's just a rent-seeking thing. So this has all been about trying to come up with new models for innovation. How do we fund R&D and do this when we intend to commercialize it with a business model that's open source? And so there's ways to make money with products and services without charging for the license or royalty and trying to control the underlying idea. And if you look at the history of commerce, most successful things are examples of that. You have to build a business on top of a technology. You shouldn't be trying to charge for the technology itself. Technology is not really valuable. It's just a tool to do things and build and exchange value, right? But most of the time, companies and industries are going to try to extract.
Well, it's a short-term grab, isn't it?
They're going to try to charge rents, on whatever. But we would never have anything if we didn't have standards, whether it's like a USB standard, all of our protocols
People have
powering
to
the
agree
internet.
on something.
Yeah, you need to
Protocol.
like get everyone to around an open protocol, and then people can compete and build an ecosystem on that. But most of our economy is like Apple is notorious for this, of course, right? They're one of the worst actors, right? But they have faced competition from Android and from all of the stuff in our smartphones. There's like commodity chips, made in Korea, made all in these different foundries around the world. And that's why your smartphone is now essentially cheap. It's been subsidized, right? So we've been trying to make that happen in biology. And the question was, how can you bring that into life sciences? Because it still costs $1 billion to create a drug, to bring a treatment from an idea to actually get it ready for patients. Or it costs $1 billion to get a crop approved, right? So that means only these big pharma companies, big Monsanto ag companies end up dominating the market. And no one likes that. That's largely why people are freaked out. They don't understand like GMOs. It's because you've got these big actors doing that. And it's we've been trying to say, hey, no, this is just a tool. Like gene editing is a tool, like anything else, programming biology, the way that you're programming your apps, right? And that's the future we want, is where anybody
And that's what your business is.
Right. So we've started this lab here. I did one previously in Silicon Valley that was like one of the first ever biohacker lab in the world. It started in a garage in our house. And my roommate.
What defines it a biohacker lab?
Yeah, I mean, biohacking is a term. It gets thrown around a lot, and it's sort of edgy. It has some problems to it because it's not that precise.
About drugs mostly.
Well, it depends. There's a bunch of different groups doing different types of biohacking. Some refer to it, as like self-experimentation on their body and trying to optimize some aspect of their mental cognition, functioning, or their hormones, or their, that performance enhancement, right? We're talking about more like tinkering with living systems and programming and building, prototyping biology, just like you would come into the garage and do welding and soldering, and you would prototype electronics, hacking electronics. So if we could bring that into biology, then that means you don't have to be forever in a degree, getting a PhD postdoc, and then only in a university where you'd even have access to getting into that lab equipment.
So what's the criteria to get into your lab?
Well, so basically for me, I'm usually dealing with early stage little companies. They're seeking space. They call up. I talk to about 5 or 6 per month, and I just rent them a bench. You can come in. This is the workspace. And it really is, it's tough. You got to have some kind of funding because it's expensive to do research. You can spend several thousand a month on materials.
Right.
Right. So if you don't have some sort of grant or a small investment, or you just pay for it out of your day job. A lot of them do have other jobs in town, and they work in biotech during the day.
Making the 24-hour fitness of labs.
Well, a little bit, yeah. But it's just, it doesn't scale in the same way that those do, but it's not that different from doing a gym, right? I mean, I've used that analogy before. It's that back in the day, only weirdos had access to weights. You had to build your own weight set in the backyard, and then it became a mainstream thing in the 70s and 80s, and now you have these franchise things. Now, biology is probably not going to be that widespread, but in another 10 years, we do imagine much of it can be done on a laptop. You'll use design software to build the genetic circuits to basically see what the protein is going to look like. If we can ever get good enough at simulating protein folding, you can do a lot of this just with your computer. Push the button, send the order off to specialized companies
What kind of stuff
fabricate it.
Are these people that want to do open source sort of biology coding? What kind of things are people interested in developing, if you can share any?
Yeah, I mean, it's very broad, right? Because you're going to say like biology is really, you need to think in terms of like the 20th century was chemical industry. You remember The Graduate, the famous old movie, plastics. That was the advice.
And now it's like, stay away from plastics.
Right, exactly. It's because we used petroleum, which is a short-term loan from the environment. Basically, we were greedy. We wanted like the quick fix. We kind of exhausted all of our, it took many millions of years for all of this stuff to store in the under the ground from dinosaur bodies and stuff.
Fossil fuels.
Right. Okay. And so we harvested all that. So the idea behind this biotech revolution is that we're going to replace most of those bad processes that are energy intensive, bad for the environment, with biological manufacturing, biological production. Our bodies do it already. We've been doing it for millions of years. It's one of the most marvelous, efficient things there is. We're even talking about using DNA as the next data storage medium. Instead of chips, you're going to have DNA-based data storage because it lasts 100 years at room temperature, right? There's some drawbacks because it's very slow. It's very slow to read.
How much data can you store in DNA?
You can store everything pretty much, like your entire Library of Congress. Like
you're telling me like a strand of DNA in a petri dish?
You could essentially store all the world's data, right, in this tiny compact format because our
You're
double.
Saying, but how would binary be stored on a?
So I'm not an expert on this, and so basically, storage is not the challenge as so much as recalling it because you have flash memory. You've got solid drive. We've got old magnetic tapes, right? So for doing this and encoding it on DNA, the technology is now there to basically sequence everything cheaply because it's come down and costs so much. To pull it up would take a long time. So it's not going to initially be used for anything that would be rapidly accessed. It would be like long-term Library of Congress.
What's something in the next 10 years we should expect coming out of like biological startups or biotech startups?
It's all over, man. I mean, traditionally you have, of course, medical therapeutics.
People trying to fix diseases and curing illnesses.
That's been very difficult for 50 years, right? You've got this whole biomaterials field. We've got printing organs and tissues. We're going to be able to eventually, the goal is to have replacement organs.
Well, let me ask you, what do you favor more than others? Like, what is it that you think is more valuable at this time?
I am most urgent about human longevity, life extension.
Gotcha.
Right? Because we're
if we can stay healthy long enough, we have more time to figure stuff out.
Yeah, and we have this huge amount of old people coming with the baby boomers. It's going to decimate our economy because you're going to have more frail old people than ever before. There's not enough nursing homes to deal with it. It's going to be a huge drain. Japan is already there because they had such an elderly population, and their ratio is all messed up because people are having kids later. So now you've got like a giant old generation. There won't be very many young people to take care of them. You're going to have robotics to help take care of elder care. That can help some.
Can I ask them the obvious question?
Yeah, sure.
Is it worth keeping those people alive? I'm not saying this in like a,
right,
in a negative sense of like, but I'm just thinking like,
well, if you look at what we do now, of course we do everything wrong. We do it all backwards. You spend way too much money late in life to try to prolong a tiny bit of life in bad quality.
Yeah, you spend your whole life like not taking care of yourself, earning money, and then you spend the money to take care of your bad health.
Well, but we're talking about a new medical paradigm. So I'm working with some groups of early adopters. We have a bunch of people in their 50s, and they're going ahead and experimenting with. There's a lot of drugs that are already approved for other diseases that can actually just be used in combination for healthy, life extension to try to slow your aging and ameliorate some of the damage of aging.
Right.
So the hope is in the future, you're never going to get debilitated in chronic disease like that. We're going to intervene earlier and earlier in the process. And in the future, you'll just go get like a booster shot. You'll get a cocktail of longevity treatments every 5 to 10 years. You'll have these different stem cells, thing every 5 years. It'll be different timelines. So you basically keep yourself from ever getting to that disease state.
Right.
And we have to change the whole medical system right now because it's configured and set up only around paying for a doctor's visit for a disease that's already happened. You've got to have a preventive model where it's like a subscription-based thing where you're all rewarded for staying healthy, and you never dip below this like red line because it's easy to correct if you're just a little bit below, you can still bring it back up. And once you're down, it's like anything. Hard. It's like weight gain. Once you've gained way too much weight, it's so much harder to come back. It can all be done. We have a lot of the tools to hack behavior. We're just applying it for evil purposes right now for advertising and marketing. And so, there's a bunch of different combinations that we can.
What do you recommend, I guess, would be a good question for people that, majority of the people that ask me this question, from my former bodybuilding experience about health and fitness is like, how do I lose weight or look better, feel better? But most of them are not necessarily willing to go to the gym for 4 or 5 days a week. And that's fine.
Yeah.
So like in terms of, the way our diet's structured. So I guess a couple parameters I'm going to put on you and then have you answer is like, let's cover for somebody that would be a full vegetarian.
Right.
Not necessarily a vegan, but a vegetarian. So not eating meat. Because I think that makes it a little bit more difficult for you to get non-carbohydrate protein sources.
Yeah, it does, definitely.
So it's like, okay, that's a tough enough challenge to fight. And for people that probably already have really shitty insulin sensitivity because, I think as you mentioned, most people are pre-diabetic or diabetic
from
already.
Western
from
diet.
just the way of lifestyle in this country.
I mean, there's not a simple, any kind of one answer to this because we have a multi-billion-dollar self-help industry and fitness industry and all this. And
I just want to know your opinion. Basically,
anything can work and nothing can work. It depends on how intensely you do it. It's more about applying yourself to the process. Like, I think the simpler is the better because the more complicated steps you have, the less you're going to adhere to anything. So the simplest things you can do are high-intensity interval training, some kind of sprint or other thing, and it's got to be uncomfortable. If you're not huffing like you're about to wheezing, if you feel like a little bit sick after you've done the thing, you did it right. If you're just like working in your comfort zone, you don't shock your system. You have to challenge the mitochondria, do all these other things to create that adaptation response. And again,
Your
that's
body
like,
wants to stay in homeostasis. It doesn't want to change.
So you have to do this high intensity, doing long-term jogging or a treadmill or elliptical thing for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. That's not going to do anything to your baseline calorie. It makes a tiny bit of difference. So
It just takes a lot longer.
Where you see it doesn't work. You'll see people do tons of cardio and they're skinny fat, right? You have to do interval intensity. It's a categorically different type of training. It makes your oxygen consumption ramp up, and then you're burning more all the rest of the day. So that's like your number one thing is some kind of high intensity. And then, I've been experimenting a lot with fasting. A lot of people can't stick to this. They get low blood sugar.
Naturally fasting. I've been like waking up, and generally the first meal I'll have will be like 12 or 1 o'clock, sometimes even like as late as 4 o'clock.
Yeah.
And I just don't want to eat, but then like around the time when I want to eat is usually in the evening. And then I don't know if you think I want to know if you think it's bad, but I usually even eat before I go to bed.
Yeah.
And I haven't noticed necessarily adverse effects from it.
It's probably fine. I mean, it depends. People react differently. Sometimes they say not to eat after 5 or 6 p.m.
Well, I mean, that doesn't make sense if you're fasting all day.
Yeah, for the rest of the day. I think, the number one people fail at all this stuff because they just can't stay on a program. So the main thing is get some simple program and stay on it. Consistency.
Do what you can work.
Consistency is the only thing that matters, because nothing else matters if you're not actually doing it. So
yeah, all right, but you're giving me answers that I can already find online.
Right, exactly.
What I want to know
is not like a secret thing. There's a bunch of weird exotic crap that you can do.
What about like
exposure? Like
what about like some nootropics or some drugs that people have like experimented with that you know of that you can tell me about or talk to about?
Sure. I mean, that's a whole can of worms. There's a zillion nootropics that are tried in different combinations, and you need to just like slowly experiment with this. Don't go overboard. People often.
Well, okay, let's start with something that's low risk.
I mean, like paracetam is the oldest classic.
Paracetam.
Thing. Most of these things are just what they're doing is increasing blood flow to the brain, right? Exercise is going to do that same thing.
Sure.
Right.
Paracetamol?
Paracetam, not paracetamol.
Oh.
Paracetam. Yeah, so this is like the classic original one out of Russia and stuff that's been used for decades. Out of
Russia.
Well, a lot of these are pioneered over in Eastern Europe. Yeah, it's a pretty subtle.
Is this how they're getting to us, Joseph? Is this how Russia's taking over?
No, this has been around before that. And these guys, the Qualia guys, they're based here in Encinitas.
Oh, really?
It's a company called the Neurohacker Collective. There's a bunch of
brain dust, really?
There's a zillion companies marketing their own brand thing now.
But how do you know any of this shit works?
You got to just do your own research, and then you can subtly start small doses and then track it, document it, look at your cognitive work that you're doing. So you can measure certain
how much of it's placebo?
Exactly. There's always that element to all this. But I would say fundamentals are about habits, establishing that, and then you add these sprinkles on top, right?
Yeah, I'm not trying to ask for what is like a magic pill you can take to become, superhuman or anything.
I mean, Ritalin and Adderall are highly sought after because of this, right? And people have become addicted to that, and they're using them, dependent on it.
I played around with Adderall in college to like study, and then I even played around with Adderall. I shouldn't even say the word play because it's not a joke at all. It's a very serious substance. It's quite dangerous, actually. And some of the things I noticed was the insane amount of appetite curve.
Yeah, it'll definitely help you diet.
I can literally go.
A lot of people use it as a diet aid.
A lot of people use it in dieting, and I didn't know this.
All amphetamines will have that kind of response.
Apparently, so I had one of those kind of twisted coaches from the 80s, right? Yeah. And a lot of stuff he told me was like, yeah, the girls just take cocaine, so they diet because apparently cocaine does the same thing. Is that you're not gonna
It's a central nervous system stimulant like that.
And like so, Adderall was such a trippy thing because you could definitely notice. So if I took it like 2 or 3 days in a row, and I didn't take it the next day, I definitely felt like my brain was not sparking properly. And I definitely knew that I wasn't sleeping as like I was asleep, but I was not asleep.
Yeah.
Like your eyes are closed, you're laying there, you're aware of the actions that you're doing, but for some reason you're definitely hyper sensitive to everything around. You're not fully like in deep sleep at all. Such a trippy drug, man. And I can't believe we're giving that shit to kids.
Yeah, well, that's part of the whole like medical complex where, a drug becomes kind of push for a particular indication, and then everybody aligns around it. The psychiatrists do what the drug reps are pushing, and the parents don't investigate very much.
I even saw this in one of the documentaries about pharmaceuticals where they were basically saying doctors, and I have a lot of them in my family, right? So I'm not saying that all of them are bad or anything. I'm just saying doctors will listen to these pharmaceutical reps as if these pharmaceutical reps know what the fuck they're talking about.
The doctors don't have time to read any articles, primary literature themselves, because they're overstressed in the system. And then these slick sales reps who are pretty much right out of college or somewhere. A lot of times, honestly, it's a girl with a big chest. I had a friend that we knew, she did that for like 12 years.
And they make a lot of money.
They make a lot of money because
I thought about going into pharmaceutical sales.
It's legalized drug pushing is basically
you're legalized
drug pushing. So what I've been advocating for a number of years now is like, we get rid of that system. We have only patients themselves all freely exchanging information about drugs and generating their own reports. And like, because right now it's like FDA signs off on something, but there's no actual guidance on marketing and how the sales stuff is really carried out.
Right.
It would be much better, I think, if we had all of this stuff in the open. I'm saying deregulate it in some ways, because you can actually take some of the perverse incentive out when you don't have a like mercenary sales force out trying to increase utilization for a particular drug and particular disease. They'll invent new disease categories to stretch the thing, to try basically get more use for a drug.
It's crazy.
But I mean, to say there's not like a drug is neither good nor bad. It's how the drug is used. There's some drugs that are kind of bad, like heroin. There's not many good, it's not going to be too many.
Well, I believe it was wasn't it like a painkiller at first?
Yeah, right. Exactly. But there's some, like there's properties of drugs that make them unwise to use for routine cases. Right.
What about like, what's your take on people extracting, substances from plants like DMT or psilocybin from mushrooms?
I mean, again, it's largely because we've banned it for so long that people are forced to kind of underground,
just curiosity,
to do their own thing. It would be better if we had made this a legitimate area for research.
Because from all like some of the research that I've done into it, it seems to have a lot of benefit cognitively. Like psilocybin, Dr. Jordan Peterson is a very famous clinical psychologist now. He talks about some research studies there where people that have addictive habits and then giving them psilocybin to treat that almost gives them like much more openness as a trait. And it's kind of like, well, how do you actually give a trait to somebody,
it can shift you, because we're all on these different spectrums. Right now, we pretty much use alcohol to shift our consciousness.
Right.
People have been doing this for thousands of years. It's just that an industry came up around alcohol and legitimized that. Remember, we banned alcohol for a while in Prohibition.
Prohibition was going on.
Right. But for whatever reason, psychedelics became, marginalized in the 1960s.
Right.
And had been forbidden for 40, 50 years. And now it's finally coming back now, and they're doing trials in depression.
Have you experimented with any?
Not that much, no. Some of my friends are into that and consciousness research and work. So I may be doing some this year. I might do a retreat with one of them.
That'll be cool. Yeah, I would love to have you come back and share with me what it's like.
Whatever. I just don't know. Like, we don't want to supercharge, I think, because I'm pretty.
Well, have you tried meditation?
I have tried some when I was in London. I did for that year. I joined a group that had a meditation school, and I had a hard time sticking with it. I'm able to stay with my bodybuilding and a few things, but then it was like, you got to establish a new habit.
I think it's very, very important, Joseph, to be able to sit still.
Sure.
And not be fidgety all the time. Because I find that even sometimes when I'm trying to sit still, this thing doesn't want to shut up.
Right.
And I think there's a certain amount of practice that you gain from trying to sit, intentionally in one place and be like, I'm just going to not judge all these inside thoughts in my head. And essentially, I found that to be sort of the, I guess, not purpose of meditation, but a definite byproduct that makes you feel really good. Because when you can sit there and realize that your mind is chaotic and it's just like this computer that's constantly trying to compute the world around it and all the different sensory inputs that you're giving it. I mean, it's a fascinating tool if you understand that.
Yeah.
But so many times we get caught up in that loop of that fascination that it's producing. And we're like, holy shit, there's all this stuff going on in my head, but you think it's actually happening for real. And not if you actually sit down and realize that none of that chaos is actually happening. It's all made up in my head. And you only realize that when you're like, I just sat down for 10 freaking minutes and I couldn't even like make myself be calm. So I think it's very fundamental. I feel like they should teach this in school.
Yeah. Well, we used to have nap time in school. I guess it was kind of enforced nap time. Man. Well, I'm kind of a proponent of what they call unschooling.
Yeah, we've definitely been kind of taught this pattern that we need to, undo and adopt a new style of living for sure.
Say that we just do all this in groups that people can self-select and not have formal,
not have anything shoved down your throat.
Mandated schooling. I don't think it should be required that you have to go to school.
It's kind of happening with like Khan Academy started it a little bit, and now you got all these online courses, and I mean some of these big universities even are doing it. I know I've taken a few courses online from Stanford.
Sure, I mean, and part of that thing with these hacker spaces that we started, there was the intent would be a network of those kinds of workspaces, and you could go between them and then go and do your bio module over here and learn these skills, and then go over to the welding shop and learn the mechanical engineering part hands-on. And the problem has been very difficult to compete because we have to set up these labs and sustain them, and then you're going up against the existing university model, which is basically funded by combinations of property taxes and other things. But in the future, anyone ought to be able to do any course, sign up for it, and show up and demonstrate. I think
there's a lot of benefit to that. I mean, it's communally better for us if we have more and more people having access to education. People have the ability to get out of their situation that they feel that they're trapped in. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to keep this, institutionalized and keep it so separated. I'm really happy that you're doing
taking
what you're doing,
a long time. I was pretty naive in 2001 when Napster came out. I thought we were going to be a few years later, everyone would be their own
we're
artist.
A slow changing world.
Right. And instead, no, the people, they hold on to power for a very long time.
But I don't know. It's kind of weird because in some ways we're slow, but now with social media and things moving at such a rapid pace where the president can say something crazy and the next day it doesn't even matter. So it's like, what matters
that's our attention span has become compressed to nothing, but there's still sort of like these deep change things that are happening on civilization
I definitely
scale.
feel an unrest. People are definitely more at
Everybody's
unrest.
Stressed out.
People are definitely
have anxiety
not sure what's going on. They're freaking out.
But if you look at like astrophysics time, you've got stars, have certain lifetimes, cosmic time. We're like a blip, on that time scale. So things are speeding up, sure, like from a exchange of information perspective, but then like a biotech stuff still taking decades for things that you're like, what's going on here? Why isn't this going?
Is it because
faster?
Partly a lot of the money that, like you said earlier, has gone into the tech field and not necessarily the biotech field?
Yeah, it's partly because we're impatient and don't have
biotech takes much longer than
all
software.
These investors are spoiled brats now too because they got
ROI.
They got rich in the .com pop, and then they're just used to that, and so no one is building infrastructure and doing these long-term things that got us here.
Right.
We spent a long time after World War II laying the groundwork. This is why we had the boom in the 1990s of the .coms, because it all came out of Cold War research and long sustained funding that built some of this infrastructure. And there's a real danger now that some of these institutions, things have collapsed. Even our NIH, National Institute of Health here in the U.S., has been cutting budget for years. That in real terms, of real dollars, the amount of funding has been shrinking for a long time.
So how does one go about, so like a startup comes to you and they want to use your labs and facilities.
Sure.
How are people going about getting funding primarily nowadays with this?
It's brutal. I mean, you either have to have some kind of friends and family, like any entrepreneur.
Wow.
Or you're writing these grants, which take forever. So a lot of times they'll already,
government grants, or
there's usually these small business innovation grants. But it's all takes 2 years on average. So maybe they already put one in a few years ago and they finally got something awarded, and that's why they're calling me, because they need space. It's a real problem we need to solve by basically educating. We've been trying, and my friend up in Silicon Valley helped start one of these other accelerators that became the biggest in the world at the time for seed stage biotechs. So they try to go out to tech investors and all these guys that made a bunch of money doing some dumb app and be, hey, biology is the next big thing. Biology is the next information technology industry. And it's helping. It's brought new money into the space. At least there's more, but it's just a never ending thing. And again, it comes down to, I was talking about capitalism, these problems of like everyone has to work for a living.
Right.
Well, if we had basic income or some other stipend, then you can just actually go work on your inventions. Okay, so the biggest thing is going to be a systemic shift. And if you had 5 of your friends and you all have your basic stipend, you can pool your money and launch your new innovation, right? So we have a gross maldistribution of the planet's resources and wealth because Bezos and Gates end up with like 100 billion or whatever each, I guess Bezos.
Asymmetric distribution of wealth.
So it's not efficient. I mean, they'll say like that it's efficient. It's actually inefficient to have a few people controlling resources because they don't have access to all the information. Everything shows that markets function better when participants all have a distributed information and distributed money. We would have no market if it's 2 guys that have $1 million each.
Fair enough.
If you have 1,000 people with $1,000 each, now you have a market, even though the size of it is the same. It's $1 million market cap,
right.
Whether you got 1,000 people or one guy with $1 million. It's better to have 1,000 people with $1,000 because then they can vote with their $1,000, so to speak, combine, trade, and they end up with a new equilibrium. So this is how markets are supposed to work.
Right.
And what happens over time in capitalism is that it eats markets and they end up with no more market, just a super monopoly. So that's kind of, I think things like basic income are one big part of the solution. In the next 12 years, we're going to be seeing that. It's going to get worse with automation taking all jobs.
So what has BioTech kind of brought in scope for the longevity field?
Sure.
In terms of like, what can we look forward to, or, what do you think?
So right now, we're on the cusp of a new sort of revolution in genomic medicine, being able to do precision, personalized medicine, where
like based on
you can sequence a person and start to tailor treatments right to them, and eventually you're going to be able to make therapies and drugs out of your own cells. So gene and cell therapy is the whole kind of emerging category. Very expensive right now. But eventually, and it's
what
really
makes it so expensive?
It's a combination of problems. It's the business model is configured in a way, especially in the United States, that everything's around insurance reimbursement. So you have to get a particular procedure or a particular treatment approved for this one label, one use, and then they're going to charge a lot of money for that. Eventually, you're going to be able to reprogram your own cell types to do many different functions. There's only a few companies right now that will offer for you to take bone marrow out and bank your own stem cells. And then, the thinking is in 10 or 15 years, you'd have access to that and you've saved some of your younger cells.
Tell me a little bit about how stem cells work, because I'm not too familiar with it.
Yeah, so I'm not a regenerative medicine expert, but I will kind of give you the bird's eye view. It used to be thought that cells were pretty much fixed at a certain point in time, that you could never reverse them or reprogram them in anything. We knew that certain organisms like salamanders and reptiles could regenerate, you would chop off an arm and it will regrow, but it was thought that like mammals and humans had lost that. So then around 1996, we did Dolly the sheep, the first ever cloned mammal. And then that, again, freaked out a bunch of people. They thought we were on the verge of cloning humans, which didn't happen at the time.
Successfully cloned a sheep?
That was 1996. Yeah, Dolly the sheep.
What?
So that got a bunch of people like freaked out about embryo research. And then we had, when George W. Bush was president, he kind of put a freeze on embryonic stem cell work
Dolly.
because of the abortion debate, because we have this weird fixation in the United States.
She died.
Well, yeah.
On 2003.
So basically, what we learned was that we were wrong about this fundamental assumption on biology that you can actually reset cells by giving them these like epigenetic signals, essentially. So, but as we're aging, our cells are losing that capacity to do any of this, and then you just get more and more worn out. The older you get, you depopulate your stem cell niche. So all of our bodybuilding is actually activating muscle satellite stem cells. But then a lot of times you'll notice the older bodybuilders, they'll hit like age 40 or something, and you can just see how it just looks different from the youthful muscle, right? And eventually you start
Muscle
wasting.
maturity.
Yeah, but eventually you waste away, and by your 70s, you have a bunch of atrophy because your stem cell population is just worn out. You've gone through it and depleted it. We have a limited amount, but the reason we form scars, I have like one from where I sliced my thumb on a thing, like certain organisms, will heal and there'll be no scarring at all. And eventually we're going to be able to do that. They've done some experiments where they've applied right after a wound, they've applied some drug compounds that have the stem cell activating effect, and it can actually help heal that thing with no scarring.
I got to look that up more.
Right. So again, recently, a few years back, a Nobel Prize was awarded for what's called the Yamanaka factors. It's this Japanese researcher, Yamanaka, who discovered them. So he came up with these 4 different factors that can serve as a switch to basically set back any cell type to an earlier, you could take any donor thing and turn it into whatever cell type you want.
Right.
You could take this adult induced pluripotent stem cell, and it used to be thought you could only do this with embryos, but they wanted to find a way around the controversy of using embryos. So if this is the case, then in the future, we'd be able to use your own cells. And you want to be careful about mutations and stuff because you've accumulated damage over a lifetime just from sun and UV, all this stuff, right? But the thinking is we're going to be able to essentially reprogram your cells or administer some combinations of drugs or gene therapy switch to basically reprogram you in your body so you could kind of reverse age. You could roll back one particular organ, make it more into a youthful state. Most of the stem cell treatment so far is just like injecting it into the body, hoping it goes to the damaged area of inflammation. It's very hard to track the outcomes.
I think from what I understand, a lot of the diseases and stuff end up in many of the sort of organs that are not, as far as I know, what I'm trying to get at is, can your brain really be that optimal at that point? Let's say we increase lifespan.
Yeah. We're going to have to deal with the aging of the brain as well. And the body and the brain influence each other.
Right.
You have the hypothalamus and all this stuff serving as sort of an aging clock. They've done these experiments hooking up old and young animals where they stitch the young mice and the old mice together, and they show that the old mouse is rejuvenated while the young one is damaged. So yeah, we're going to have a whole way of delivering therapies into the brain, which has been a problem with the blood-brain barrier. But there's more delivery technologies now. They're working on it all the time. It's why it's so hard to treat things like brain tumors, glioblastoma that John McCain died of earlier last year. And that was probably from his skin cancer he'd had years before, and then it metastasizes, ends up in the brain. There's very little we can do for that these days. But in the future, we're going to be able to have special ways to deliver a payload into an area of the brain. When we get better and better at this, you could even give yourself plasticity in your language area and learn language like you were a kid again. Like when you were a baby, you acquired language without remembering it.
That would be nice.
Right? But we have to be very careful of this because you could give yourself a brain tumor too. You don't want to upregulate the plasticity so much that you start growing crazy connections and weird stuff. We could have all sorts of strange synesthesia, people that hear colors and smell sounds. That happens when their wiring gets crossed. There are people who have that naturally happening, and some psychedelics can make you experience that. So in the future, we'll be able to go in and change that neuroplasticity and potentially have brain-computer-machine interfaces where you'll have certain, thing grafted into your skull to interface with machines, and you use combinations of biotech and neurotech to either electrically stimulate one circuit of the brain. You could do things for depression this way. Parkinson's, they already try with Parkinson's. They'll do a deep brain implant in here because your motor neurons have died, right? So you're shaking all the time. So they've had some success, but these are very primitive. We're going to need several advances of, just the way computers used to take up the room and then had to be shrunk down and get more and more powerful. We're going to need that equivalent for these neural interfaces. Then there's dangers of wire heading, where we just use this thing to give ourselves a hit all day long. You're doing nothing, but you're getting extreme pleasure like you're a
I think they've done some experiments with rats, and they do 500% of.
So we're going to have to
have in a coma, right? I believe they get in a coma.
And we're going to need to learn how to program. We're going to have direct control over our reward center and over our anger. So you want to be careful that people are not like hacked or being lobotomized, right? You can imagine governments or other people trying to, once we've all implanted ourselves with this, somebody trying to get access to it and then, hack your emotions, right? So that's where it all comes back down to encryption, things that we're talking about with Bitcoin. And it's about taking ownership of your own private keys and getting people in the habit of doing that rather than leaving that to Apple or whoever, that you rely on now for your security. You don't want to have that situation where the devices implanted in your body are all...
And somebody else has the key.
Or get repossessed because the corporate decides you didn't make the payment.
There was a movie about that. Do you remember? It was called Repo Man, I think.
There's a bunch of those. Yeah.
Where the guy basically goes to repossess people's organs that they sell them. That shit's
a common
insane.
Theme in science fiction, dystopian stuff. Yeah. So, it's going to take a combination of new technologies, stem cells, gene editing, gene therapies. There's existing drugs that can be used in the meantime to try to rejuvenate us to some extent. But it is not certain that anybody age 30 and above right now is going to make it. Like there's probably a cutoff point where people born today are very likely to live 1,000 years old, but everybody born before this thing won't make it. Just like when we had the polio vaccine, first antibiotics were discovered that could cure, pneumonia and infections that would have killed you. But 5 years later, we actually had this thing. So no longer, it's not fatal. Now it's no big deal. It's routine because we've surpassed the threshold with our technology, except with some of these infections now we've got antibiotic resistance.
Do you believe that in your lifetime that you will live longer than average?
It's tough to know. I think we're pretty. No,
I mean you personally.
Yeah,
do you believe
pretty
that?
Conservatively that I think we can get to 120 now with existing technologies and applying preventative medicine.
Well, by all the changes that you're doing to yourself.
It's hard to know. Like the maximum we can do with this paradigm of technologies is around 120 and get there in decent shape, not completely frail and trash. But to get beyond this maximum lifespan, it's going to require these.
So you're essentially doing this not just to gain, that much benefit in this lifetime, but you're really just setting the stage up for the potential of the future.
I'm going to be pissed if we didn't get our act together. It would have been better if I could have been born 30 years later, right? If I'm 6 years old,
you're pushing that innovation or letting the doors for people to come and innovate.
It's upsetting to think about it. If you do the math on this, it's 150,000 per day people that are dying of aging. So every year that this is postponed has destroyed more lives than any natural disaster, any global warming, anything can ever do. This is why climate change is one of the stupidest things that I hear people freak out about. It's because look, it's not going to matter by the time we've ruined the planet. We're going to be changing ourselves into fish people or something anyway. You'd have fucking gills or something. You can just go live in the ocean.
Somebody was telling me,
you know what I mean?
What if we think we evolved into dolphins or something
that? The thing is, if we're going to Mars or we're doing anything, we're going to have to change our physiology to withstand radiation and do all this anyway. Yeah. It's not like we're just going to stay static. I'm saying, yes, we shouldn't have ruined the planet, but it's ridiculous. We're going to be wiped out by artificial intelligence, any other thing way before we get down 100 years from now and climate change has screwed stuff up. It's not going to be relevant. It's not a real threat on the level of the type of technology we're envisioning, nanotechnology. Any of these things coming could wipe out civilization way faster than climate change. And it's not going to be that hard to change our bodies to adapt to different conditions, because we're going to have to do that when we go into space or wherever we go anyway, right? I mean, there's only a few places on the planet people want to live, like California, right? Nobody wants to live in the desert or Antarctica now anyway, right? Antarctica is pretty miserable. Right. But you can live there if you have to go on the research expedition and live on the base for 6 months. Right. So
what about I don't have enough of an opinion on the global warming and global climate change, but I do know is that there's definitely patterns of, geological patterns you can see that show that this planet's been through so many catastrophic events and perhaps we're overdue for another one of those. Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, the problem is, yes, certainly we are screwing up the climate. We're increasing it. But so what? There's all kinds of things happening. We'd be destroyed by asteroids anyway, right? We're not building the planetary defense grid that we should have been building. This is a problem for multiple things. It's not just climate change. We don't have a civilization level plan. We can't get the U.S., China, Russia. Everybody can contribute 1%, 1% of GDP for like the laser defense thing for the asteroid, right? So what it's going to be is going to have to come down to civil society. And what by that I mean all these organizations. We've had many throughout history, like the Red Cross was like an international affiliation. Right. And they were not political. They said, we're going to go out on the battlefield. It started in the Civil War, right? And so the idea was it would be respected by any combatants on whatever side. You would wear that red cross. They would give you safe passage on the battlefield so you could tend to the wounded on both sides, right? And there's many like examples of that. Linux and Wikipedia is sort of a global commons. You could be a contributor anywhere in the world. We're going to need these kinds of peer-to-peer network groups to come together and crowd fund the space laser that can defend us from the asteroids because our damn governments can't like do it, right? And take on climate control, climate change, and things like this. It can be, I believe, solved by technological groups of experts, technologists, and common citizens coming together, pledging funds. You can do it with cryptocurrency, actually. You can fund a lot of things. You can issue your own currency just to fund that project, right? That can be used to basically for the good of humanity.
So people, wow, that's a lot.
I mean, it looks like Elon Musk is trying to do versions of this with his stuff, but he basically forms different corporations, right? And that's what's worked for him. Although there's problems with Tesla and problems with SpaceX, and he kind of has them all interrelated and shares the stock between them. So there's a bunch of like messy stuff with how he structured that with the SEC, and he's gotten into problems with the SEC in the past. But at some level, I think he's trying to engineer these kinds of things for the future of humanity.
Right.
That was all he could do then was use the corporation. He's doing it more than
anybody else right now.
Right. Well, so what I'm saying now is these crypto communities, they've actually created billions of dollars in value in like a few years by issuing these tokens. You have Bitcoin and you had Ethereum was like number two.
I remember.
So we're just at the beginning of that. We could tokenize all sorts of things. Like you want to go to space, you could like set up a tokenized thing to pay into that. So you could get your own. People
can elect where the money goes directly rather than like paying taxes, so to speak, to have some government decide where it goes is what you're saying,
and
right?
It's more efficient because you can actually globally allocate it and let everyone vote. And it doesn't get diverted necessarily. I mean, there's problems. There's a lot of problems with crypto scams right now because
it's just early. People
we're just setting the rules. Right? Humans will manipulate every system for their own benefit and try to pull.
I mean, you could argue systems are meant to be manipulated.
Well, yeah. I mean, any human system is going to have people defecting for their own purpose. But when it's transparent like this, you can see it happening on the blockchain. Whereas our governments are just like stealing it. They've been doing that for centuries, right? And there's no accountability because they changed the law and they say, oh, we made this legal retroactively, confiscate your property or whatever. No, we changed the law, right? That's just what they've always done, right? So we're headed for this new form of governance potentially, which can be incredible if we can get it right. But
and is that what excites you, Joe?
I mean, it's one of the things that I'm most optimistic about now is this blockchain stuff and Bitcoin particularly, because I think Bitcoin is really.
I feel like the hype around crypto has died down just a little bit since the big, 20,000 to the
inevitable. That was going to happen. It got too many obnoxious people jumping in for the wrong reasons, like any field that gets hot. I mean, this has happened to everything from bodybuilding to whatever. You got a bunch of wannabes. Yeah,
that's kind of funny. Like you talk about bodybuilding. It's like I was going to say, social media is so funny. It's like I remember when I was trying to, do bodybuilding and all that. It's like fucking everybody's a coach now. It's like everybody thinks they do one show and they're a coach, other than a nutritionist now. It's like copy pasting the diet that you got from your coach. You don't even know shit about nutrition.
Yeah, on the one hand, it's good because it's mainstream. You've had our activity becomes mainstream, and then the other hand, those people don't stay with it.
No, that's the thing. It's like you walk back and you're like, yeah, this shit was about real passion. You can't do this long term.
And that's true for the blockchain. All of the best projects are going strong now while things are quiet, and they're working on the things you'll hear about in 5 years. And that was all done during the 2018, 2019 bad times, right? The same is happening for biotech. Like we're going to hit this thing in there'll be another big bubble in biotech, like in 8 years or whatever. And then you'll have this peak of stuff and then that'll kind of pop. We'll go back and then it comes back stronger the next time.
So what is it that you try to like focus on? I mean, tell me a little bit about your this year, what is it that you're focusing on?
So like I said, this year I'm still getting Bitcoin. My goal is like accumulate Bitcoin for the next, X amount of time.
You're buying it at like $4,000 right now?
I'll just buy some amount all the time. Every week you get a certain amount regardless of what your price changes. Cause you got to set like a goal. You say, I need 5 Bitcoin or 10 Bitcoin, whatever amount you think a long-term thing is you want to have. And then you just find opportunities to accumulate.
Gotcha.
Set aside whatever amount you can afford to do that.
What else?
Maybe 100 a month. I may or may not do another bodybuilding show this year. I'm going to try to get down to like an all-time shredded low body fat. That's my goal.
That'd be nice. What are you planning to do? How are you going to do that?
I've been basically dieting since June 2018 and I'm going to keep dieting. I'm not on a super strict. I'll go like, it zigzags, right? And then you got to refeed and kind of back off.
I think you're going to need to pick a show if you're going to get that level because otherwise you're not committed to it.
No, that's right. I mean, I'm going to I'll keep pushing it back.
I know some people like that. They're like, I'm like 10 years out, bro, for my next show.
No,
it's
exactly.
Like, I'm just going to constantly bulk until the next one.
Possibly in June, although I have a class reunion I might have to go to.
At Harvard?
I don't know if I will. I would be the first one I go back to, the 15-year reunion. Yeah.
Shit. You should go back and see if that dude's still there.
So bitter. No, he's moved on. He ended up taking another position at some other place.
Man.
I looked it up. Believe me, I checked in on this guy every 5 years or something. Had bad intentions for how I could finally get back at him. But, I think I'm talking about doing the podcast. I mentioned that we're going to really bring in experts on each one of these components from stem cells to all the different areas I mentioned where we break it down for an hour show on each one. And then, I've got a few other business ventures I was trying to put together, but it's like there's never enough time. I've got one thing that's really all around access to certain kinds of cancer treatments. Some of these newly emerged immune therapies can cure people, but it's really for certain types of cancer, leukemia.
Yeah.
The problem is we don't know which people will respond. So it's like you'll either get the cure rate or you won't get any response. And it can be like $1 million. Right. So that's the problem. It's like, so we're going to try to address that by maybe taking some of these patients that are on waiting lists who haven't been able to get in because there's only a few hospitals doing it and it's hard to get into a trial. And we'll see if we can bundle them together. I mean, look, if 10 of you want to come and do this, we'll negotiate a price with the hospital.
Nice.
And we got to do it for cash because it's being priced at like $500,000 per treatment, but that's like the insurance price that they're trying to set. And so the reality is that hospital set up to equip to do it could basically, we can make them an offer and we could come to an agreement somewhere between $60,000 to $100,000 per person. Right. Wow. And so I'm very interested in trying to hack the economics of this because I'm opposed to what's happening right now is where they're setting the price at $1 million per patient because they know most people will be declined. Insurance will refuse to pay for it. But then they'll give it to a few hundred people whose insurance agrees to let them have it.
Right.
And the pharma companies like that because they make the most money that way versus letting the price become pushed down. They'd rather have 50 people get this thing that costs $500,000 than they would 1,000 people have it at $50,000.
Right.
And because they also like to keep prices high because anything that pushes it down threatens their business model. And that's,
so you're really trying to shake up just the way a lot of these structures
economics
are so rigid.
Of healthcare is totally broken.
Yeah.
And then I have this other one around working with patient groups. We have an Alzheimer's patient group. There are a bunch of people that don't have Alzheimer's yet, but they were diagnosed with a gene that's high risk for it. So they started taking their own drug combinations. And,
how does one go to find out if they have the gene for Alzheimer's?
You can take any number. Usually it was 23andMe was the main one.
So here's my problem with one of those. I don't want to put my shit out in any database for anybody else to have.
I know.
So that's
I've had that discussion with people. So I basically just tell you to just forget that. They're going to have your DNA no matter what. People are going to get it.
Did you hear about, Brad told me about this. There was a guy who got caught in a 30-year-old cold case.
Right, because his relatives did an ancestry test.
Oh my gosh.
Sure. I mean,
I'm not saying there's...
That's true. I mean, I would say just get used to it. We're all going to have our DNA out there in the near future.
I figured. I mean, it's an inevitability.
So you're better off getting that data and learning about it. And there's some blockchain ones that are doing it where you can do your DNA on the blockchain and then they'll secure it for you. Well, nothing will be anonymous because it literally takes a couple of pieces of data, like a credit card thing and a zip code, and anyone can de-anonymize you.
Right.
They'll anonymize you, but anyone that's persistent could run an algorithm and uncover your identity, reverse it back and figure out who it was. So that's not really what you should be worried about. You should be worried more about the economics of healthcare delivery, insurance companies and other people starting to screw you because they don't like one thing you're doing in your lifestyle. And we're not going to fix that by secretly trying to prevent our DNA. Your DNA is everywhere. Every time you take a crap or you do whatever, you're leaving spools of it all over the environment. So I would say it's really cheap now. You can get not just you can do whole genome sequencing now, which used to be super expensive, right? So for a few $100, you can get your whole genome.
So let's say you take the test and you find out that you have the gene for Alzheimer's. What are certain things that people could do?
Yeah, well, that's what we're looking into documenting. We're basically
doing some research on what helps.
We're enrolling these people in this long-term study. We're going to follow them for 2 years. They're going to be journaling all the stuff, and then we have these advanced metabolomics panel where basically take what's called a mass spectrometer, and even from relatively small sample, little bits of blood, they can run a panel of dozens or hundreds of different markers and find out all the stuff that's happening from your nutrition, from the drugs you're doing. And we have some pretty good ideas of which drugs, based on the literature and animal studies, actually can help prevent progression towards Alzheimer's. And we're going to start enrolling 100 people at a time in one of these subgroup studies and have them do it for 6 months. Then they can stop taking it, switch to another one, and you can start basically people doing their own longitudinal trials. And you could be enrolling in one of these. You could do it if you wanted to sign up and do nootropics and be like, I'm going to take this one for 3 months and I want to see which of my marker levels shift. Right. And I want to sign up for another study because you find out about this group over here using this different drug. Right. And you can all share that data. And we imagine maybe doing it as a subscription service business. It's like $100 a month gets you in the group study platform. So just like Weight Watchers or whatever, used to do a diet program.
What is it that people criticize you the most for about the field that you're in? What are the major kind of concerns and criticisms you get?
Well, everybody hates a lot of the stuff. They're scared of it. They're afraid.
Just the lack of unknown, right?
Well, it's partly our whole medical system is all built around the FDA and regulatory approval. People don't like patients being able to get their own medicines in their own hands,
right,
and decide to try things out. People are very uncomfortable with this. It's a very paternalistic system, right? There's also paternalism, like daddy knows best, finger wagging. And this is true to the medical profession. My dad's a surgeon, right? So I grew up with this. And they have a very certain mindset, and they're not used to being challenged on anything. People don't like the fact that patients are more informed than the so-called experts in many cases now. And the patients, for their own disease, will read obsessively about the latest developments, and they may have more insight and understanding.
Right,
they may also be
passionate to them.
They can also psych themselves out and go off the rabbit hole and have a conspiracy theory about it too. Sure. Right, so there's both sides of it, but only by increasing the transparency in documenting this. And that's really what's missing, is having better blood tests and better markers that we're going to help people get access to so they can actually see what they're doing instead of just a placebo effect. And, I felt like this that day, it could have been completely in your head. And then, of course, the whole biohacking, gene editing and stuff is freaking people out.
They think we're going to make some crazy monster or something.
Yeah, this has been a classic thing. I've been dealing with this for years. When we first started, we had to go in for these FBI meetings once a year. They'd bring us to DC. They brought me and all the other biohacker kind of community labs. There are only a few in the country in different cities.
So you classify as one of them now.
Well, they were trying to do outreach with us to kind of understand biosecurity threats and what is it going to be like when this stuff is in everybody's basement or your bathroom and you can be brewing up, doing this stuff at home.
Can you make a monster?
It's a legitimate concern, but
really far away.
What
right?
I've said is mainly it's all government labs and universities that have been the ones that have always been irresponsible and have weaponized things in the past. So having public labs where people can go and access this is much safer. Because otherwise you are going to get people doing it at their house somewhere secretly.
But do you think somebody should be administering what kind of developments are happening? I mean, isn't that partly what you would expect for some sort of institution that is overseeing and has oversight?
This has come up many times. I would say there's no way to legislate this and to try to.
That's what I think Elon Musk was trying to do with the whole AI stuff. He's trying to embed himself into different companies that are at the cutting frontier.
Right? It's too late. You have to align people's incentives, right? Because we are biology. You're not going to be able to legislate somebody's genome or genomic thing. It's ridiculous. These different strains of things they're exchanged every day in the mail.
Well, I mean, even in the sense of weaponizing, you'd want to have some way of preventing that. Obviously, from what you said, maybe that's already been, it's already out there.
The answer is eventually, some bad actor will try to weaponize something. And unfortunately, our system is not very prepared. We're going to need to overhaul our entire infrastructure for how we do public health. You're going to need smart vaccines that can be uploaded. In the future, the best scenario would be that we have embedded DNA sequencers and sensors all over the environment. Our sewage system, airports, everywhere would have these small chips that can sample the air.
So hold on, can you explain what a DNA sequencer does, first of all, so we understand what it is that you're trying to explain?
All right, so basically, we can detect different diseases and pathogens through a bunch of variety of techniques of molecular biology probes, right? So in the 1980s, the main one that was developed was called PCR, polymerase chain reaction.
Okay.
And it's actually won the Nobel Prize. He went to high school with my parents back in South Carolina.
PCR?
Yeah, so PCR was really a fundamental development. And if you remember the O.J. Simpson trial, it was one of the first times people were exposed to this. It's how they did the DNA evidence.
So it's chain reaction is a method of widely used molecular biology to make many copies of specific DNA segments.
Right. So basically, it's like a needle in the haystack, but if you know what the description of the needle is, you can magnify it and you just make a bunch of needles, right? So that's how I would explain it. So we know most of the sequences for different things like avian flu, influenza, Ebola virus, all of this stuff becomes documented and published. So we know what the different letters of the DNA are. They're code for that. Now in the future, one of the dangers is we could synthesize that too. You could synthesize whatever pathogen. We could even make up new pathogens that had never existed in nature yet. But some bad actor could do that, print it out. You could model it on the computer and synthesize a new form of virus that no one had been immune to.
So then everybody's screwed.
Right. But what we're imagining in the future is we'd have this surveillance system, global pandemic surveillance, and you'd have different sensors on a chip, and they could be mounted in different strategic places like bus stops, airports, anywhere that is a pathogen hub where people are spreading.
So you could detect it essentially. What kind of
right? And you have the idea of the Internet of Things, right? So
right,
the Internet
IoT.
of Things with these sensors in the environment, and they're streaming, and then our algorithms hopefully alert you, and then somebody either the CDC or probably you'd have a network of these white hat hackers that are the good guys,
right?
And they're ready. It all depends on open information exchange. So if governments and everybody's being secretive about this, actually handicaps your ability to react. And right now we have sort of an arms race with China going on around DNA sequencing because China is going 100% on this. They're sequencing all their population.
This is like the moon race for DNA sequencing.
In a way, it is. But I encourage people.
I'm Canadian today too,
right.
by the way. I've been listening to too much Peterson.
Right, but the wrong model would be the Cold War USSR, nuclear arms race.
Right.
We have to have an open
the extreme.
exchange of information, right? And then what happens if something happens? You can go and download a smart vaccine because we would cook up the antibodies. We could predict, the thing, and then you just upgrade your immune system with that.
That's
patch,
crazy. You're
right?
just like update.
Yeah, so that's kind of like, this is the far out, 30 year, 40 year, 50 year.
I love it.
Sort of thing. But
it's funny, man. I know that tech and all this stuff, it's going to be there before we know it. So it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, basically, we're learning, we've already learned to read DNA cheaply. We're going to be able to write DNA inexpensively. That's the next step for synthetic biology, synthesizing stuff. And then we're going to need to be able to boot it up and put it into our bodies, figure out how to safely,
without having it go crazy.
Contain it. Yeah, you're going to want to augment different parts of your biology. But
Seems like the third piece is the most difficult.
It's not just biology. I tell people we're already using contact lens and all kinds of augmentation. So it's both mechanical interfaces are going to be just as dramatic as biological upgrades. You may have people choosing to amputate their arm or leg because it's better to have a robotic implant now. It's a superior technology.
I was talking to you about this the other day. I was asking you, what would you think about having the same sort of brain, but then having a full Terminator style body, but then your brain would kind of be.
There's different cyborg scenarios, right? Where basically you could replace most things, but your internal organs, you'd probably need the chest, your major organs here in the chest cavity and the brain. And you could replace all your limbs like now. I mean, I know there's a guy, he's an interesting guy on Instagram who's like a birth quadriplegia. He has no arms and legs, only one part of one arm. And he's like a fitness Instagram guy because he competed in physique. So that's interesting. He's a motivational speaker now too.
I think I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, Nick. Or whatever, Nick
Vujicic?
Santos or something like that.
That's another guy.
So, and then there's all these people with limbs blown off from war injuries and stuff. So I think we're pretty close to having an exoskeleton where you could put your torso in and just start manipulating the limbs.
That's so cool.
Dr. Octopus style,
Oh, yeah.
We have extra limbs. I would want to do that because then you have a pair of hands doing other stuff.
I was talking about
playing piano,
part of his
typing over here, and you get your food over here, have it made. Right. So that's definitely coming. So people usually get hung up on biology. And I can remind them, look, biology is just one type of technology we're going to be using. We're probably going to be doing more in extreme augmentations through merging with mechanical systems than biology. It's going to be a combination of those things. Because there are only so many things you can do with biology, and it doesn't make sense. It makes more sense to use a mechanical prosthesis and graft it on. And it's all about how we interface with the technology. But yeah, I mean, there's risks to all of this, of course, but I don't think no one is going to remain unenhanced. We're already
at some point.
We're already doing enhancement. You're already using caffeine, coffee. People are just hypocrites about what they think is an acceptable enhancement or not. They're it's like a pure
What I'm doing is okay. What you're doing is not okay.
What I'm doing is natural, but your thing is weird. It's like, no, man, you've been using technology since you were a caveman and started to pick up a rock. That was the first time people cheated and were no longer natural or whatever. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Right.
How far do you want to go?
So, but yeah, and then some people want to go all the way to post-human, basically meld with machines, become like a machine. And I don't know. I haven't made my mind up on this stuff. It's hard to know.
I mean, all of this speculative. We don't know anything for sure. Tomorrow an asteroid comes, we're all fucked,
this is why. I'd say you do have to prioritize. We need to focus on aging because that's urgent, and then that gives you more time. So you can slow down and figure out these other things. You don't have to rush.
Yeah. Do you think once you started focusing on the sort of, longevity sort of piece, did it make it more chaotic inside of your head, realizing that you have such a limited, finite amount of time here?
Yeah. I came to awareness of that at a pretty young age. I had a awareness of death and mortality when I was like 8 or 9 or something, thinking about this and looking at my pets and stuff too, because they age at a faster rate than humans. So
you definitely had a higher level of consciousness as a kid.
Yeah, I mean that's
Is that due to your dad? Maybe.
It's combinations of different things,
Yeah.
upbringing and intelligence and stuff too correlates with that. And then just my mother mainly took the role in like she would read to me from a really early age, like age 2 and 3, and read to me all the way up through into middle school, or like, she would always read to me like a great book. So that's probably one of the biggest.
Do you like to read yourself?
Things. Yeah, I read constantly, just
That's
massive
awesome,
amounts.
Can you believe it or not? I hated reading, but I've recently started really enjoying it. I can't do too much because I don't have the attention span to sit there for hours and hours, but like I definitely try to read 5 to 10 to 15 minutes in the morning and like maybe 10, 15 minutes before I go to bed. And
well, now people are consuming this type of podcast media and audio.
Oh, and I listen to audiobooks whenever I'm driving.
Yeah, audio is good. You can do it at 1.5 speed or whatever.
That's right.
Although I read really fast, so I can sometimes read a transcript.
How do you get better at, how do you get so fast at reading? Do you think it's like a practice
started
thing?
Early and read massively all for years, but you can do techniques. I never did a speed reading.
Yeah, I thought about doing a course, but I was like,
I think it really was just like a muscle, like everything else you use.
I definitely notice I'm getting a little faster though as I read more. I've been noticing like where you look on the line
you can
help, so you can periphery read a little bit. So notice some weird shit like that. That's kind of cool. But
well, yeah, it's like anything else. You got to use it or you lose that. The brain only does which pathways you train and reinforce.
Yeah.
And that's a problem for me. I'm like worthless at certain things. I get lost. I have bad spatial navigation. And it's probably, I don't pay attention. It's like I have selective attention deficit for those things. You can drive around, you just didn't pay attention and you're off on something. And now we use this friggin' navigation thing for everything on the phone.
Oh yeah.
So you're completely reliant on it and you atrophied all of that.
I mean, I think it was one of the philosophers, part of probably one of Peterson's lectures was like, the moment that we decided to start writing things down, we gave up the ability to remember.
Recitation, yeah. You used to be able to recite long lists of people's
why do people remember stories? Why do people remember poems? Is because they're trying to pass information down. That was just the medium then,
Yeah, and I used to have to memorize some of that in school. They would have us memorize passages from Shakespeare.
Even when I was growing up, they did that a little bit.
I had a few for years. I had the thing from Macbeth in my head. It was like tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesteryears of something, whatever, out, brief candle, and then I've lost it. And then it's like full of sound of fury signifying nothing. So I've got like 60% of that soliloquy still in my head from high school. Cool. That was from age 16 or some crap, right? Yeah. 36, 20 years later, I have part of it, but that it's buried somewhere, right? Yeah. Useless. Right.
Have you found certain tools or certain things useful that you recommend people to do to kind of sharpen up their knife of their intellect?
I'm like weird and lazy in some ways about this.
I really find that hard to believe.
Well, so I'm weird about things. I'm the opposite of these Tim Ferriss types. They like to do all these productivity suite hacks. And I'm very impatient for those kind of things.
How so? Because I'm pretty impatient myself. So let's bond.
I hate systems and habits. Don't give me another
framework.
Tool. I don't want another piece of software that I have to keep a friggin' email. I'm very lazy about certain things. They say that stupid cliche about the CEO will just wear the same pair of pants every day of the week, or whatever, so you don't spend any mental energy on that.
I think that's stupid.
Well, I'm kind of like this with my sweatpants. I'll just wear these workout clothes most days of the week. I have the same outfit and I'm going to switch it out. So I just have to spend no mental energy on that. I'll do the same thing for eating. I would just eat the same chicken breast or shake or whatever.
That's because you're a bodybuilder.
Well, right. I know, but it's also my personality type because I'm using this brain power on these weird ideas. A lot of time,
fair enough.
I don't have much left over for planning what I'm going to wear or what I'm going to eat that day.
Yeah.
So yeah, I stay
outside of all this
from,
shit, do you not sit down to watch Netflix? Do you not?
Yeah, I watch a bunch of crap. I waste.
What do you
look like?
What do you like to watch when you're just brain numbing yourself?
Sci-fi mostly.
Come on, man. You're like, I gotta stay related to the field.
Well, yeah. I binge the usual crap, Westworld or Game of Thrones. I guess.
You excited for Game of Thrones?
I'm kind of over it at this point.
You already know what's gonna happen, right?
Well, it's all messed up because the author George Martin didn't finish writing the books. They overtook the storyline and the things. It's kind of forget it. I'm ready for it to be over.
Yeah.
But then they're going to do these dumb spinoffs. It's just terrible.
We'll see how it
goes.
They're
going to ruin it. It's just going to get greedy.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I don't do any weird productivity rituals. I know there's a bunch of people that swear by these things.
It's just about like you said earlier, man. It's just about what can you find that works for you. And I've found this more and more listening to Peterson. It's like you have to negotiate with yourself because you're a terrible person to manage yourself. Yeah. You set these insane expectations on yourself. Like I did it myself, like Brad was here the other day and we did like a podcast and I'm like, okay, I got to edit like 15 different videos so I can have all this content. I'm like, dude, it took me 3 hours to make 3 videos.
Never get it done. It'll be exponential adding on. So I would and I'm bad at a bunch of those things. It's like, there's a bunch of stuff I'm not suited for. I'm not detail oriented in this. So I have like many things that I just cannot do. I'm not suited for. And that's the problem. It's like ideally you want to have a team, some kind of thing where you can delegate and have these things structured, but you need money to do that. And you're bootstrapping, you're screwed. And that's why most of these ventures, things can never get off the ground. It's like, it's rare that you have like a combination of talents and then also embedded in some sort of organization that can leverage that.
Right.
And I've been on my own for years doing this as a sole founder or entrepreneur and bootstrapping these things.
What has that been like? I'm curious, like the whole entrepreneur
miserable.
experience.
Honestly, it's like this masochistic thing.
It is. Right? Well, I mean, kind of the bodybuilding nature is masochistic, right? It's like, I'm going to inflict this much pain on myself. I'm sore. I don't give a shit. Similar. I'm going to keep working out, overtraining, and just... then people go crazy with masochistic with the drugs too in bodybuilding.
Yeah. I mean, that's the problem is like I'm able to start certain things and get them to a certain threshold, but then it's like scaling is a different skill set.
Yeah.
And it's not really my skill set.
Yeah. I mean, you could definitely bring somebody in.
And I don't like managing stuff. I have to oversee some large, boring structure. But, you just like, that's the beauty of these tools. In a way, these kinds of connected tools are letting us outsource from our weaknesses and try to use that technology to make up for what we're not temperamentally suited to do. But again, and I don't know, I kind of think you should just play to your strengths. It's not worth trying
what have you found to be your
train
strengths?
Your weaknesses. I mean,
I agree with you, by the way. Yeah, I think you should maximize your strengths and not focus too much on what you're not good at.
I'm an ideas person. I'm very good at making connections, getting people to do stuff they wouldn't otherwise do. I'm able to like induce them, to try to get, I've spent a lot of time trying to advocate for open science. We ran 3 of these conferences. They were fairly successful, I guess, but I'll take on these gigantic things like the biomedical establishment or these things. There's just, and I finally realized, okay, well, I was delusional. I didn't know any better. I was like, I come into it thinking I'm going to change the world. Okay, good luck with that. And I've met, other versions of myself coming up behind me, younger. I was like, okay, well, yeah,
you're looking at one right across the table.
No idea how monumental that is. And then you have to like step back from that and realize, okay, because otherwise you just destroy yourself.
Yeah.
Crashing up against it. Right. And then, I've learned to just like try to back away from stuff.
How do you stay like level headed? Because I'm sure, do you just keep yourself too busy to have time to think like outside of, let me ask it a different way.
Yeah. I obsess on lots of stuff.
But you must have bad days. You must have like your down moments. How do you pick yourself back up?
I have a lot of cynicism and like anger and negative emotion.
That's where the gym comes in.
Get stuck in, and I have to be able to train it out. And then a lot of times I'm ranting on Facebook like a maniac, kind of like Trump.
It's therapy.
Yeah, I rant out all this like stuff. It's fun for me. People don't really they're not going to get it.
Well, it's one of those things that you're doing it. That's the weird thing with social.
For me, it's like I'm journaling it. I'm practically journaling it,
Sure.
And then the people can tune in if they want to see.
That's essentially what this is.
The unfiltered madness.
Yeah, right? That's kind of why I wanted to do a long format discussion.
Yeah, I'm trying to deal with I've had a lot of problems with my negativity coming out in interpersonal relationships where I rant about stuff a lot. That's just always been my style. And I'm growing up and I'm argumentative and very interface. But then sometimes certain people or relationships, they cannot interface with that. They feel that it's hostile towards them or whatever. And I've in the past, I've like made that mistake where I'm criticizing different things and done it as a personal attack when it shouldn't have been. Like I would rant about people's career goals or say, oh, that's stupid or do that, or housing, like getting a mortgage.
I think you're just opinionated, and that just doesn't sit well.
No,
with
I've
people.
realized I have this negative. You know what? It's I grew up around a lot of this from my dad because he does that too, and so it's genetic and it's a learned thing. So I've had to,
I have similar stuff in mind.
Find my communication style and learned that okay, stop. Don't even do that. There's no point in criticizing, right? It doesn't do anything. I will rant about why it's dumb to buy a house, to be a scam, basically to get a mortgage on a house, because it's this part of this debt system, debt slavery thing. And then I finally realized, and I was dating this girl at the time who was, it's okay, well, her goal is to own her own home, right? It's not going to, it fucking doesn't help for me to throw, she's not going to get that I'm critiquing capitalism and saying that that's a
I think people take you too literally rather than the broader sort of point that you're trying to make and where is it coming from,
Well, no, I'm not. And then I have been on the other side where I've debated with other technologists and people in Silicon Valley and stuff. And I've realized, hey, they're just have this nasty, aggressive argumentation style. And then it can get off on this thing where it's just, and it doesn't help, because then it does become where it's they're attacking you,
right?
Whether they mean to or not. And it's did I sound like that? That was how I was doing all these times to these people growing up. And I'm I got to recognize that. And, because you're not going to influence people that way. And most of the things we're talking about are so controversial. People have what's apparently has been called this guy in the 70s, Future Shock. Alvin Toffler wrote a thing.
Future Shock.
It was one of these classic prediction futurist books. There's a bunch of futurists out there.
Like Kurzweil?
He was one of the Kurzweil. Yeah, I know Kurzweil.
Yeah.
I have some opinions about him. I've known of him for years. I've been in a bunch of stuff with him for many years. And I think he's okay. So a lot of the people around him have appropriated his stuff and turned it into almost a cult. It's like Scientology for tech people, practically. That's how I would call it now.
Interesting.
But but then the idea is you can only introduce someone to an idea that's one step beyond their comfort level and familiarity. It's now
because then they can't connect to it.
People didn't know what a smartphone was, but they knew what an old a telephone was.
Right.
You start talking about machine interface uploads and
take your cell phone, walk back to 20 years ago and show it to somebody. They'd be like, the hell?
This is why when I would go out and evangelize, I've kind of stopped evangelizing for life extension and longevity. I'm fuck it doesn't matter. Either you're gonna be dead because you didn't embrace life extension, or in 100 years everyone around will have adopted life extension because they're the only ones that survive. Natural selection
will take.
Well, no, I'm saying we do need to persuade people to some extent to support this, because every extent that they're slowing it down is killing another 150,000 people a day, right? But I finally realized that going out and preaching at them is not having any effect. The same as the Mormons showing up on your door and, let me tell you about the Lord. It's not going to work, right? You have to engage people in almost a seduction way. It really is flirtation, seduction, not this in your face thing, or they're just going to shut you down.
Yeah, there's definitely an art to presentation, and there's an art to displaying an idea, and I think there's certain people that do that really well, So
and Aubrey de Grey has been the main global ambassador around longevity.
Oh, okay.
Stuff. So he's kind of the world's most prolific speaker. I've known him for many years, back before he really took off. He has this crazy beard. It's very unforgettable.
Oh, Lord. Look at this guy.
So Aubrey has done this for almost 20 years now, and he's basically moved it.
Did you meet him in London?
Yeah, when I was over there, I went out to Cambridge. He used to be living in Cambridge University.
Yeah.
And we've known
2000s, right around the same time.
We've known each other pretty well. He's one of 12 people I had to my 30th birthday party. So I didn't have that many people come to my 30th. But I'm going to have him on the podcast probably to do on the life extension episode. We may have him down for one of the meetups, the longevity meetup.
Wow, that'd be great.
Anyway, I've known him pretty well. But he actually took this crazy idea from being completely dismissed in about 2004. When I first got to know him, the idea that we could actually do human life extension and make it a legitimate thing for bio people to work on, because it was looked at as complete, you're a lunatic freak if you dare to work on this or talk about it. And in about 13 years time or whatever, he moved it from where, and it got mainstream not quite totally mainstream, but real serious people. Jeff Bezos investing in a company that's a life extension company for Senolytics. It's called Unity BioTech. The Google founders, a bunch of the big money people in Silicon Valley have made significant real investments.
So you think this is a good change in the direction then?
I mean, it's a first change that we needed. It's certainly not complete, but it's like we went from nothing, from complete, you'd be laughed at. It's getting the right
eyes now.
You're getting laughed at, to now it's like, okay, yeah.
Yeah, because those are some big names, right? To catch attention.
It is.
And Amazon and
right. And I ultimately,
Google are looking into it.
I don't think they're sufficient to be the patrons for this. It's not going to work when it's just a few billionaire people supporting that.
Right.
We have to have a full, legitimate life industry of longevity stuff that has to be built out. And it's been snake oil scam people for decades. That's what the problem is. You always attract this weird fringe element to these types of ideas. And so you have this division of labor. You have the evangelical side, and those people are great hearts, but they're incompetent typically. Then later, probably 15 years later or more, the competent people show up who are actually going to reduce it to practice and do the work of commercializing and disseminating the real on-the-ground innovations that consumers will interface with, just like computers the same way. You had early people that preached about personal computers and were like here spreading the ideology, but they never actually built the stuff that became the, you had the early innovators like Gateway Computer. I don't remember any of this stuff. Dell, Michael Dell, they actually packaged up the personal computer and made it in a way where you could get it in the hands of consumers. And that happens in all, it's dissemination of all these things. And for anti-aging, we're still like, maybe the first wave of therapy companies coming online in the 2020s, where they're going to give the first rounds of treatments to people in their 40s and 50s.
I have a question. Have you ever considered this? My girlfriend's Asian. Have you ever considered how well Asian people age compared to others?
Yeah, there have been studies on this.
What is your take on it?
The longest lived populations in certain regions of Okinawa in Japan.
Right. I've heard that.
It's both the diet effect.
They're also the most depressed people there, right?
Well, no, that's more like Finland and stuff with no sunlight.
Because even the biological factors of it. Yeah.
But it's partly diet. So Asians definitely, their skin especially seems to be much younger.
Yeah.
And more resilient. But they also avoid the sun like the plague too. That's the whole thing. So they're avoiding that, and that's not having that UV exposure. Right, which ages you more. I do this tanning booth, which is terrible.
I used to do the tanning booth, and when I was competing, man.
And I was using this melanotan too, the peptide that gives you the sun.
The melanin that changes your...
I like that a lot.
That's easier.
It gets you super dark, in a short amount of time. But I think it messes up your pigment stem cells, so you kind of exhaust them faster because you're turning them over faster. So I use it maybe a few times a year, but not like prolonged all year long. There's definitely, some unbelievable, 40-year-olds on social media, Asian women that look like they're 20.
So I wonder if there's something that's in their DNA or something that we can understand if there's contributions to
even
that.
Individuals are varying. We have an aging clock, our biological age is not our chronological age. And there's some new biomarker tests you can take now. It's a panel that'll show you based on all these 500 markers what they think as a composite your quote biological age is compared to what your birthday age is.
Right. And I also feel that so I went from being very, very active, being a bodybuilder, to then once I moved to Silicon Valley to try to work in tech, I became less active, just being the nature of being in a workplace, and you're just exhausted by the end of the day, and you're just and then more and more I started to stay indoors and be less and less active. So I kind of went to the polar opposite of being, from a bodybuilder. And I noticed that my body itself and the way I felt and carried myself and my emotions and everything definitely changed. I felt like I was getting it more rigid and older.
Right.
Joints were not feeling the best, I would say.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's the moment I started shifting, my lifestyle changes, started moving, towards a better direction.
Yeah. No, I agree
noticed all this shit, and my body was starting to feel better. It felt like it just cooperated. It's almost like I've made my body younger.
Oops.
All good.
For a second. I'll call them back.
Yeah, all good. We're probably about to get to wrap this up in a little bit. It's been 2.5 hours. Can you believe that?
I know. It goes, you're going to get wound up.
Can't even believe that. This is the longest one I've done.
I don't know who will make it through.
Yeah, this has been good. But just to wrap it up, like I felt that there's a tremendous amount that you get from working out as a benefit to your aging, So I think that's...
Yeah, just staying movement is really important for everything. All the studies have shown that. And there's an argument to be made. We should be giving people some kind of subsidy to be able to work out, because it's going to save so much in healthcare spending.
Correct. I agree with it.
Or it should be carved out of the work day somehow. But of course, any attempts to push those policies usually end up getting manipulated or abused.
Right.
But there's a lot we could do to re-engineer our lifestyles.
I'm a strong believer from my experience there is just that like your mental health is very much related to physical activity. If you're not doing any amount of physical activity and you're in shitty mental health, that would be a really easy way to try. Just take yourself out for a 15-minute walk.
Yeah.
Change your scene.
It's very hard when you're in a rut like that.
Yeah.
People can't break the
cycle. Yeah, I know. And you're just caught up in that loop.
Move.
And that's what happened to me is I would just get real caught up in that loop and you don't want to do anything. I still don't know how to break out of that, to be honest with you, because I remember even thinking to myself, like, who the hell am I? I don't even recognize this person. Why am I so...
Well, I've had multiple periods like that over the years where I had these several big prolonged crashes. And at one point, I even went and did this experimental transcranial magnetic stimulation, signed up for a research study. And basically, they're doing magnetic stimulation to the part of the brain to try to alleviate depression. And eventually there'll be home devices like that. There are some now on the market you can get for direct electrical current stimulation.
Did you feel it worked?
It's hard to know because I did 2 batches of it. One of them was a placebo part of the trial. And then the other, you're guaranteed to be in the active thing, but it could also be that just committing to do the trial and taking the 8 weeks.
I think also like
you're going to be pushing stuff out because like I'm making myself show up 5 days, this many days a week to come down.
A lot of, I think getting out of depression is committing to yourself and building up a pattern or routine of some sort is like, because you essentially what it is you're not able to find any meaning in anything, right? You've become completely
I've been
like
injured. When I got injured like this, I can't train. And I know and I had my surgery repair last year, but I'd planned for that. It's like when we're not going to fall in a rut, we got to make sure I go sign up and do legs with this trainer this month to make sure I'm doing. So I have someone to make me train again. And then I was able to kind of steer out of that, which otherwise could have become a bad, a prolonged down episode. But no, there's good drugs, certain antidepressants. I mentioned Deprenyl is one, looking into Selegiline, which is a Parkinson's drug. Very good for dopamine and just as an anti-aging drug. And I find that it helps to stay at a baseline. Take it just once a week or twice a week. Makes you a little more resilient and you're just more resilient to all types of stress.
And I think testosterone plays a role in that. And I think a lot of young men today have low testosterone, which is crazy.
From environmental estrogens and things like that.
Yeah, and the poor diet increases your estrogen metabolizing more and more. It's just, I know for sure I went through some phases of that too, and definitely doing much better than before. So like,
yeah, you were telling me that. You got to stay
crazy,
on top
man.
of it.
I know. So I think for me, what I found works is like, you definitely have to do things to keep your mind in a good, healthy state, which involves some form of physical activity. It definitely involves stimulus, like giving yourself positive information, like good reading material or like listening to shit that like is going to give you good stimulus rather than just the normal like social media manufactured. Everybody's life is so great. Like you got to set aside time for that. I think those are 2 definitely very important things. But shoot, Joe.
All right. Yeah.
It's been quite a bit. Yeah, let's wrap this one up. I'm so happy you did it. Thank you so much for being here, man.
Having me on.
I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. Again, remember, we have video components to each of these podcasts that exist on YouTube. You can simply search for Blossom Media Studio or The Real Abhinav. Either way, you'll find the episodes that you need. And see you next time.